Yeah, let's go.
Hello,
Got it.
welcome to our podcast. I'll be your host, Larry Du. I'm joined by Mike Buhl. Welcome to the podcast here. I was just interrupting you about the recent podcast that we looked at by uh, Markus Lanz and Richard David Precht, two German intellectuals slash journalists. And they recently had the recording where they talked about the monarchy and the British monarchy and what is their role in society, because as everybody knows, the Queen of England, Elizabeth, had passed away recently and
96.
at age 96, and gave the reign to her eldest son, Charles, who's now Charles III, King. So what do you have on the commenting
podcast.
on that podcast? Yeah.
Oh, the podcast, Markus Lanz and Richard Brecht, was actually fascinating. They dived into a variety of topics around monarchy, as an old institution that still is around, and there were so many things that discussed. The fact that so many constitutional monarchies still exist to this day. And what I did before our podcast, I just went to Wikipedia to kind of educate myself on constitutional monarchies versus absolute monarchies. And the list is extensive. I mean, not just in Europe, constitutional monarchies like the UK, right? Spain, Denmark, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, just to name a few that still exist, which is interesting. You have constitutional monarchy, you have monarchy. Maybe it's symbolic. They kind of restricted their power, but they still have representative government, right? On the other hand, you still have absolute monarchies in the world that still exist, where monarchy has absolute power, and I ran it down, particularly in the Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan, and there's others in Southeast Asia like Malaysia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, just to name a few. So globally, as a social phenomenon, it's interesting that monarchy is still a powerful institution, but maybe in Europe it's kind of restricted,
So do you think that there is an element of anachronism, right? That is to say, many countries, they've switched from monarchies, which were the most common form of government, to a republican form of government, where the head of state and the head of government would both be either directly or indirectly elected.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw this poll recently, which I also shared on my Facebook, of British people that were being asked about evaluating the monarchy and whether it's out of time. And the last poll, which they did, I believe last year or so, or 2 years ago, they found that 25% of the British people were now finding the monarchy to be obsolete.
Right.
And that has been the highest value in a very long time. I mean, normally the anti-monarchy crowd is about 10 to 15%, quite stably over many decades. Now, especially with the death of Elizabeth, who has been an institution, right? I mean, nobody was, or very few people, I guess, at that point were questioning her rule. But now, there's a possibility where, Charles himself is an old guy. I mean, he has not been, well, he has been well known, obviously, in
Right, really.
birth, but
you had to wait that long, It's 70.
Yeah, to wait long. But I guess is it fair to say that he does not have the aura of legitimacy that his mother had?
Yeah, I believe so. I think because she ruled so long, it put all of the focus on her, and I would argue as a woman, and kind of established a kind of matriarchy in England, because it's similar when Germans say Merkel, Mutti. But now all of a sudden you have a king again, right? So yeah, it's been 96 years, right? Roughly. So British society will have to get used to a male king again. I don't know if that's something he lacks legitimacy in that sense, or maybe he may not have the charisma. So if he has the ability to, be appealing to the crowd, form, legitimacy in the public's mind. I think with Queen Elizabeth II, she really was powerful in understanding that monarchy is also theater. Monarchy is theater, and you have to sell it. And that's why she did like TV broadcasts. She was doing Christmas shows. She was very knowledgeable. She knew that television was important, even in her time, when she started to rule. And I don't know how well, Charles will be in that regard. He definitely looked like he was trying to play that role. You remember the scene where he was shaking hands with mourners. And that's the first act. You try to construct an image of compassion, or you want to recognize the crowd, things of that nature. That's basically what Queen Elizabeth II did. She always went out. She understood the public sphere. So
yeah, but
he may still lack. Yeah, go ahead.
I saw a recent YouTube video with Charles. I guess it's a little bit of an older video. A couple of years ago when he was still the crown prince. He went to visit in Germany, and he actually gave a speech in the Bundestag, in the German parliament, in quite good German. I mean, obviously accented, but spoke it quite well. Yeah, I mean, if you watch these videos where he is basically interacting with the local people, and he would shake hands and he would do small talk, and his mom, the queen, did that too. I mean, did really well, and so I think there's a degree of a comportment that you're being taught from early on, as a child growing up in Buckingham Palace.
Kind of being groomed, I guess, for the position.
Yeah, you're being groomed, and then just earlier this morning, I was watching a video by a speech accent analyst who was analyzing Charles' accent, which I forgot what the official title of it was, but it's sort of a very nasal, aristocratic
oh yeah
accent that he has, and it was acquired in the 1950s when he grew up, and apparently, according to that speech analyst whose name I had already forgotten, but he says that in the early 1960s, with the Beatles becoming sort of the pop icons of Britain, the sort of older forms of English accents were sort of became, should I say, less popular, and the more popular English kind of was introduced. Now, I mean, I'm not an accent or English language expert, so of course, people can.
No, you're totally right. I think there's these caste dialects where the royalty in British upper classes speak a different tone than working class. It's something that's in the way people describe things. So I think you're there. I'm not an expert in linguistics either, but the same thing happens in Germany, and the titles and royalty, well, they have last names or middle names. Von is a privileged kind of name that you're tied to some royalty.
Von der Leyen,
I think
Commission president.
Yeah, so you I think you get educated differently, and maybe you're in a different space, cultural space, right? Which then you acquire the different language. So imagine your royal family, and you probably have private tutors and you probably, start to speak differently, right? Thinking of Bourdieu, right? Bourdieu kind of investigated this, right, in French.
La distinction, right?
Yeah, this is the
Like
French
sounding
école,
different.
the really upper class kind of French special schools versus the working class schools. The language, the French you spoke, really marked your social class, whether you get into an école, right? So
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
C. Wright Mills did something similar. I mean, if you remember the power elite study, where believe he devoted an entire chapter just to discuss the upper class Americans, sort of elites that go to certain I don't know academies in like New Hampshire and
Mhm.
up in the New England,
Yeah,
and you learn a certain way of speaking, but also I think confidence is very important. And the British, of course, were the ones that pioneered it. So if you look at the list of British prime ministers that were educated in Eton, which is a private school, and then they would study PPE, which is philosophy, politics, economics program at Oxford University, and then they would start off doing politics, particularly in the Conservative Party, but even the Labour Party, it's quite common actually.
mhm.
So um, yeah, so it's sort of like an elite academy where they teach you um, well to how to be glib, how to explain things and sound convincing. I
Yeah.
guess like the ancient Greeks, they call it sophistry, right? Which is
Yes.
I guess it's kind of like the art of like lawyering, right? Like oratory, right? It's like how do I say things that are convincing, that sound good, and do it in a very confident way.
Yeah.
Um, where like I mean, if you're sort of like more working class, I mean, you're always taught to look down and not be too confident, and be always careful about what you say, etc. And I
Definitely
think
no profanity is permitted in royal circles, right? Profanity and things of
yeah,
that
but I
nature.
don't know. I mean, if you look at Charles, I mean,
Because
there was this video where recently he was, yes, King Charles already, he was signing something, and the pen that he was using didn't work, and
oh
because
yeah, I saw that.
I think there was like a hot mic where it was like, oh, this bloody pen, something like that.
That's where
And
you front stage backstage dynamic.
yeah, the
Often,
hot mic was running, and I don't know whether he was aware of that, but or he perhaps didn't care too much for it. And perhaps now that he's the king, I mean, he sort of has the absolute legitimacy and authority, to say these kinds of things, right? Um,
yeah, sometimes, yeah. There's one more thing I wanted to mention. In the podcast, they were talking about, I think it was called estate monarchy estate. What's really interesting is with the death of Queen Elizabeth II, he becomes the the richest person in England. But there's increasingly an entity which kind of protects their properties and the castles and assets, things of that, which is managed by like a third party that's not supposed to be directly linked to the royal family, royalty, but there's still an accumulation of lots of money, right? And privileges. So I think one of the things that Precht and Lanz were focusing on as a criticism of even constitutional monarchy is that they get a lot of privileges.
they
Tax,
don't pay taxes. They don't pay
yeah, tax
taxes.
exemptions, or there's also sometimes cases in UK where they can't be criminalized for things that they do to their employees. So in that case, they're kind of exempt from discrimination laws uh, and things of that nature. So
Yeah,
the royal, yeah.
the younger brother of Charles, his name is Edward,
Mm.
and he got into trouble because was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, who, I mean, I don't know. Some people say he committed suicide. Other people said that somebody was out to murder him. But he was one of these people that he had these like private retreats that he funded, and he would basically hire sex slaves to serve rich businessmen and whatever famous people, important people, and I think it was Prince Edward that sort of got into that, made that connection with Epstein, and which sounds quite nefarious. And that's why there was a dispute about whether Edward should take more responsibility with the Queen's death within the royal family. There was also fallout with Prince Harry because his American wife is Meghan Markle.
Right.
She's an actress, and really, I think through no fault of her own, basically what happened was that so there's in the British press, there's like a subgroup in the press, and all they do is report on the royal family itself, and oftentimes it's kind of boring reporting, right? Which is the prince goes and cuts the ribbon for some park that gets opened or something, right? But some of it actually, in order to get revenues, to get viewers and clicks, it's about finding salacious material, and oftentimes it's if there's nothing wrong actually, right? I mean, if Harry and Meghan are very harmonious actually, and but the press sort of still they invented stories about Meghan Markle, and that's the reason why Harry basically flipped out and fled to America ultimately.
Get away from it, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
I think the Daily Mail, there's an online version of Daily Mail. I still read their publications, and they are really into this royal watching, and this is kind of a paparazzi kind of thing. So you're totally right. And there's even obsession of watching royalty. I know Germany, there's lots of people that watch it. They're fascinated with all the royalty. And even saw the news cycles in the US. You did start seeing a lot of news organizations focusing on a funeral, Queen Elizabeth II, not so much on Ukraine and all that. So you can see that the press also recognizes it's a good, I don't know how audience for audience purposes, but it can turn ugly. Yeah, you're right. There's a paparazzi, and then they follow the royals like celebrities,
Yeah, and it's very interesting also that like the royal press, I mean, they never target the core people, right? So when I say the core people, I'm talking about Queen Elizabeth, then it would be current King Charles, Prince William, who's now the crown prince, right? And then his wife, Kate, Princess Kate, right? So the core people, it's like no, they're untouchable, right? But the people that are like second row, like Prince Andrew or Meghan Markle, I mean, you can heat them up, right? Exactly, that's it.
Yeah, that's interesting that this is a kind of hierarchy complex. Yeah. I didn't just think of that. That's good you brought that up. I wasn't thinking about that, but you're right. There's a lot of things that Queen Elizabeth, has that people criticize of, and then it's sort of kind of not done because I think right now is the funeral or post-funeral kind of phase, and everybody is in mourning, and the flags are at half stand, even in the United States, right? So it's very symbolic, right? So I wonder if that gives a lot of symbolic power to the institution of monarchy, even though monarchy is, very anti-democratic, which is also interesting. I mean, but it gives it a kind of positive image.
Yeah, well, one thing I very much like about the monarchy was that the day that the queen died, we knew who the successor was, right? And the successor has been determined basically since Charles was 10 years old. So that was over 60 years ago, right? And that's a little bit where the comfort of the monarchy comes from, because if you're like in developed democracies and republics, it's not an issue because it's institutionalized, where I don't know, the president dies, the vice president takes over, or the speaker of that parliament or something like that, right? And there's going to be new elections to determine the successor. But think about like less stable, like autocratic regimes, maybe third world countries, perhaps, where the institutionalization of democracies oftentimes does not exist. And if they're still having a monarchy, I think that it gives a level of stability to the system. Now, there's a potential for instability in the case where the king has a lot of sons.
Competition, huh?
yeah, and then there's going to be competition, and it's even more complicated if he has multiple wives and consorts, and then of course each of them have their sons, and they want to place their own son as the successor to the current king, and then there's a potential for infighting. So I guess maybe I have to relativize my statement, but in the British case, for sure, I think that the fact that we knew who the successor was for decades now, I think is a great anchor of stability, which the British very highly prize. If you go back to who was the author of The Problems of the French Revolution? Edmund Burke. Yeah, and Reflections in the French Revolution, and he says, the French made a mistake by, chopping off the king's head during the French Revolution, because they overthrow all of the old institutions. And he talks about the destruction wrought by Robespierre and the kind of like the rule of terror, right? Chucking out the old institutions, but then not knowing what comes next. Yeah, that's right. And the British, they're very careful, they're very prudent, and they do react to the forces of time. That is to say, the Magna Carta in 1215, right? It was the first time that civil rights were defined for the burghers, which are the townspeople, and that was the first limitation on the power of the king. And then you had the Glorious Revolution in 1688, right, where basically the king was ceding more power to the parliament at that point. And that has actually kept the British political system remarkably stable, because you knew who the head of state was going to be, the person that would appoint the prime minister, but the prime minister would be the person that gets legitimacy from the parliament, and the parliament would be voted on by the public. If that balance were to be upset, if King Charles were to say, now I'm going to be calling the shots in the country, I think a lot of people would probably be anti-monarchy at that point, right?
Yeah. One of the points that Richard Brecht and Markus Lanz were making, similar to your argument, that monarchy is big in the UK, we all know that, but there are relics of the monarchy system that remain and are visible in British society. If you think about the House of Lords, it's definitely one example, the word Lords, and then, just all the symbols, including the fact that the royal person is on the money, right? And I believe they're going to have to change the picture of the Queen Elizabeth, and they're going to put Charles on there, right? So all these relics are visible in the political institutions, in the culture at large, and the colonial legacy, if you want, you can throw that in there too. I mean, it's connected with monarchy, and that's why there was a lot of criticism about Queen Elizabeth II. And the money, okay. I'm trying to think of the army, how it's formed, but isn't it still called the Royal Army, the Royal Air Force? So there's still
Yes, it's all
relics.
royal.
There's relics,
Yes.
and if you see some of the sons, of Harry, they often wear these military costumes, right? At events, including the funeral, I believe. Didn't they wear military costumes? Kind of.
Well, I mean, both Harry and William, they served in the army, so I think
Yes,
that's
but it's a militaristic kind of image, symbolism together with including Charles, the king. I think he wore the military kind of
yes.
custom. So that's interesting. That those old relics, these very old relics that we think that have disappeared, in the 21st century, they are still there. So it's an old dinosaur that hasn't gone extinct,
Yeah, but I think if you go back to Weber's definition of the state, I think it should make that connection between
Monopoly of
the military and the state, right? And the state would of course be represented by the king, right? I mean, if you really think about the definition of the state, right? It was about the monopoly of violence in the given territory, and the arbiter of violence is the military, right? And so basically, well, who's the king, historically speaking? I mean, not talking about King Charles or whatever now, but historically, the king is, it's kind of like he's the most formidable general in the army, right? The guy that would be able to command his troops, to go to battle and defeat the usually rival army, rival kings, right? And basically conquer territory, right? And therefore, the king would generally be associated with the one that's is the most valiant general in the battle, in the wars, and would win the wars. And then if he wins the war, then he has a bigger territory and he can be adulated. But historically, times of peace were kind of the exception, I would say. And and peacetime would often be used to prepare for the next war, because often because you have to till the fields, right? Because you have to feed your population and your army, right? You have to build the weapons, so yeah, so you have to replenish. And then also, like if during a big war, I mean, if you lose, I don't know, 20% of your adult male population, then you basically have to wait another 20, 30 years before the next generation of men would be replenished, right? So yeah, so that's why peace historically was exceptional, though they were important, obviously, to regenerate and recuperate. But you're right to say that there is a link, obviously, between the monarchy and the military, right?
Yeah, it's different. It's very different from modern democracies. If I think of well, if I say modern, I would call the UK an old democracy. Germany's relatively young, 1918, right? But US is also kind of old in a sense, but one thing that is different with the military is, the is civilian rule over the military forces, right? And the attempt is to totally remove that any kind of class, or let's say royalty class, has control over military. The same thing in Germany. In Germany, there's civilian rule, ever since fascism ended, the defeat of Nazism, a civilian rule over the military. That's why they're very careful with how the military is used politically and what you can do as far as parades. But that's not what exists in the UK. In the UK, you can see this militarism, like military orchestration, and then the royal family in extension or connection, even if they serve, for instance, right? They have medals, things of that nature. So it's kind of converging, and that's why I would say it's an old, like the UK is an old democracy, right? But the different tradition, I think they just mixed it together. But there's in other cases around the world, don't get me wrong, I think well, that also exists, maybe in Saudi Arabia, this, but that's clearly a monarchy. That's an absolute monarchy. But this attempt to create the military figure is also the king, and he's wearing a uniform, right? Fascinating for me to observe. And it's old relics. It's old relics. I mean, I really mean that. Why are these symbols so important? And you see it on television, right? You see this. It's almost like a Pope outfit. Every old outfits that you think of religious institutions they wear, if you think of the outfit the Pope wears, and then if you look and see how, at least during a symbolic ceremony, if you watched it, like, I was really amazed. It's like a costume thing, it's like theater, literally theater, including the burial. I think the burial, didn't they put Queen Elizabeth II, I think they put some kind of the crown or something on top of the casket, and then they had again kind of symbols, old symbol relics, symbols of monarchy, also on the casket, which is doesn't. I mean, it's interesting if you
On this
observe.
question, I mean, how important are symbols in the monarchy? I think they're very important, but it's not just within the monarchy. I mean, if you look at religious ceremonies, right, where this is these huge tall buildings, right? In the church, you have the cross everywhere, right? You have images of Jesus, and so I think this whole idea of like symbols, I think that's a very human thing, right? It's ultimately about creating some kind of coherence and group sentiment, right? Because the idea is like, so if I'm, like a British person, right, and I look at the Queen, I look at King Charles, my first association should be about Britain as a state, right? Like, because I mean, if you just strip it down, right? And you just look at the geography, right? Okay, it's an island nation off the coast of continental Europe, right? And it's got this weird shape, whatever. But it doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? Like if I live in southern England and you live in the Outer Hebrides in the north of Scotland, we're basically on opposite ends of the British Isle. And what is the thing that would connect us, right? Other than the fact that we live on the same, island. And I would say that it's the fact that our head of state, was the Queen Elizabeth and now King Charles. And so we have this, the common symbols that are, embedded within the monarchy, right?
Didn't Benedict Anderson call that imagined communities? I can't. No, that's the rise of nationalism. No, it wasn't. It wasn't monarchy. I'm trying to think of this book I once read, political science class. His name was Benedict Anderson. Imagined communities, the rise of nationalism. Now he focused on the rise of nationalism, but you could say monarchy is also an imagined kind of thing, that depends on symbols, and the symbols of the
right. It's because I mean, like if you really strip it down, right? I mean, Charles and Elizabeth, I mean, they're human beings, right? Like, I mean, if you look, at the
they're
blood,
not
I mean,
gods. I like Egyptian pharaohs,
Yeah. So I mean, so there's nothing sacred about them from the perspective of being a Homo sapiens, right? I think they're just like us. But but given that they are the same biologically speaking to the rest of the British population, then the next question is, why should the British people then respect the Windsor Mountbattens, which is a family name of the royals? And so we go back to your point about the imagined community, right? It's like we tell ourselves a story about how originally the country was founded, so I don't know, do you want to go back to the Roman times when the Romans were settling the British Isles, and around the around the time of Jesus Christ, I guess, or do you want to go to 1066 when the Normans, which were, I guess, Normandy and north of France, when they landed in the British shores, and they basically appointed the king over there, and every Windsor Mountbatten descendant then became the monarch of England and the United Kingdom. So yeah, it's about some kind of story. It's a story, and it's a reverence to tradition, right?
Yeah.
And that's what makes us say, okay, Charles, Elizabeth, they're not normal human beings, right? They're elevated human beings that we must, I wouldn't say worship, because I think that would be the level of God, but respect, revere,
Yeah, it's either in a modern, it's kind of fetishizing hierarchy, or seeing hierarchy as a necessity, as something sacred, and the belief in hierarchy as a necessity versus the belief in more horizontal relations. So I think the monarchy represents vertical relations. It makes it very clear, it's implicit that there has to be hierarchy. So I think the worship of monarchy, or let's say in modern sense, the romanticizing of monarchy, is the belief that there has to be hierarchy, and it's something sacred and natural. Like you said, traditional authority in Weber's three types was one type that he discussed as based on traditions themselves. And there's this continuity, stability aspect of the monarchy existing for such a long period of time that it starts to look like natural, and people start to not question, can it not exist? People really think it always has existed, so it must exist forever. So that's where it becomes perhaps an old relic, a dinosaur that hasn't gone extinct. All the other dinosaurs have gone extinct, but this monarchy dinosaur hasn't fully. That's what makes it interesting in the 21st century. And I think that's where Brecht and Lanz were trying to go in their podcast, which I highly recommend for those listeners, but it's in German, right?
I mean, it should be noted that I think Brecht is more of a monarchy defender than Lanz. I think, like when you mentioned earlier the example of the privileges and the non-taxation of property, right, of the monarchs. I think that critique came from Lanz. He was the one who was, ideologically anti-monarchical. I mean, not in the sense that he wanted to abolish the British monarchy, but more that he wanted the monarchs to be treated the same as everybody else in society. So
yeah, Brecht on the other side, he's more and more intellectual. I mean, he's criticizes this monarchy institution, and people, I think, in the public debate, they treat it more casually, and they don't realize the significance of this. The reality that we have this dinosaur in the 21st century that hasn't gone extinct.
yeah.
I keep saying that, but that's actually one of the points that they were making in the podcast, that it is like a museum piece that you would expect to be in a historical museum where all the other relics are, but somehow, just at least constitutional monarchy in various parts of the world, even Europe, which we often think of secular, Europe being more secular, that you have actually these old relics that haven't gone away. Right? It hasn't melted into thin air. Right? They're still there, and I think they're visible in the symbols and in the old uh, support, that even public opinion, like you said, there's what was it, 15 to 20% that were critical of the monarchy, but overwhelmingly in the UK, it's still 60% that are for it.
There's still definitely a
something like
majority
that. If
that
I had to,
wants to retain the
yeah,
monarchy, for sure.
which is maybe there might even be a breakdown between self-identified Tories and conservatives, if they are more also pro-monarchy, or if there's a divide between left and right. I would suspect there is, right? So, and
Yeah, the Tories are more pro-monarch for sure. Yeah,
that's what's interesting though, because if you think of the appeal of monarchy and how it's shown on Fox television right now, you get the impression of pro-monarchy, and everybody is pro-monarchy almost. If you watch U.S. news or television, you're like,
I wouldn't call it pro-monarchy though.
No,
I would say it's sort of like
sympathetic.
Yeah, it's sympathy, and the reason
Yeah.
why they are sympathetic to the monarchy, so that means they don't want monarchy in America. It's important to say that, right? I think there's a hand-me-down from the founding fathers, the Thomas Jeffersons, the Alexander Hamiltons, etc., where it's like, okay, we want to keep the republic, right? So I don't think anybody wants to change that piece, but rather it's the fact that because we have a republic, right? We don't have these characters that we can revere for a very long time, right? I mean, even if you think about Trump, I mean, he was hated by a little bit more than half the population, but he was adulated by about, let's say, 40% of the population, which are his supporters. But now that he's out of office, I mean, people kind of start forgetting about him, and he's already sort of part of American history, more or less. And we'll talk about his presidency in the years to come. But sort of looking at the rearview mirror, while with Queen Elizabeth, there was this continuity where really for the last 7 years or so, we kind of knew. Well, the prime minister would always be different, but I think there was this continuity of knowing who was going to sit at the throne, and having that institution that you can revere for a long time. I think that's
how many. Sorry to interrupt you. How many prime ministers did she go through? I think it was like 25.
15.
Oh, sorry, 15. Still a lot. I miscalculated. Not 25.
Yeah. So the last one, Liz Truss.
So that's a continuity. She went through all of them, and shows you the political weight.
The first prime minister was Winston Churchill.
Wow. The last one was
enthroned
Johnson, right? Oh, she actually talked to
Liz Truss. Truss was the last one.
Right.
Winston Churchill. He was the prime minister at the beginning of World War II. Right. That's what he's known for, right? I mean, fighting the Nazis, right? But then at 45, then he lost the election against a Labour politician whose name I'm forgetting right now, but he was an important guy. And then he won again in 51, and then he served for another term, and then he was pushed out of the Conservative leadership. But that's really the history, right? And also, like Elizabeth herself, she was, I believe, a mechanic during World War II. I don't think she served at the front, but she was sort of in the background and aiding the war effort back home, I guess. But again, it goes back to your earlier point about ties between the military and the monarchy. Yeah, so one more story that I found particularly interesting, not about the British monarchy, but the Austrian monarchy,
Habsburg.
the Habsburg, right?
Yeah.
They were toppled at the end of World War One, just like the Hohenzollern in German Empire at the end of World War One. And the last crown prince, his name was Otto, Prince Otto. He died in 2011,
Hmm.
and there was a very big funeral. I mean, so you had the chancellor, the president, and all of the former leaders of the country. They were all gathering together for that really formal state funeral, right? And it was really like an episode that was coming to an end with the death of Otto, who actually was so he was the last crown prince, and he was a politician in the European Parliament as a German citizen. So he was actually the CSU in Bavaria.
Oh wow,
Um,
close home, very close.
and he's able to run for political office, but the most notorious guy actually wasn't him, because Otto sort of renounced the claim to overthrow the Austrian Republic effectively. But he had a younger brother whose name I forgot now, but he back in the 1990s, so he already passed away, I think. But back in the 90s, he received the permission, I believe, also as a German citizen, to cross to the border to Austria. He went to Salzburg, and then apparently he organized a rally where he was trying to overthrow the republic.
No way. Is that illegal in Austria? Can you go to jail for that? No. No? Is it?
Yeah, well, because the context, right? So he wanted to reclaim the throne, right? That's basically what he's trying to do, right?
Yeah.
And then the police detained him, and then they basically kicked him out of the country. He couldn't come back anymore, and yeah, but that, I mean, it wasn't threatening the republic at all. I mean, because it was just him and this little entourage, but that just shows you about like sometimes history can be haunting you to some extent, right?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that Precht and Lanz do is they kind of make a long list of, let's think of all the pro-monarchy arguments. Maybe monarchy is good, and then they have a counter list, what might be the negative things attached to monarchy. I'm gonna make this point. If you think about the legacy of King Ludwig II in Bavaria, which was a monarch, the significance of all the castles he built, which is actually very similar to like the relics in the castles you think about in the UK, Windsor and Buckingham Palace, and they do leave behind buildings that a lot of tourists like to visit, including Neuschwanstein, I don't know, in southern Bavaria. But I wonder, in the same thing in Austria, if that is also a thing. You have all these castles that, with monarchy, they did build good, nice castles. And that may be one positive thing. It creates a tourism sector. And one of the arguments that Lanz and Precht make is it's self-sustaining, like it kind of reduces the money that the state has to kind of pay, but monarchy itself, even as a symbolic thing, the constitutional monarchies, I mean, that it creates a tourism sector. That you have people that are interested and they want to go see the castles, and they spend money to see it. And so yeah, that may be a positive thing. It is like a tourism sector, especially in the UK. It's a big thing, and that's where, by the way, a lot of the money often goes in the maintenance of the castles, or in that fund, the Crown Estate Fund, I think, in the UK, which is a major monetary thing that benefits the royal family.
Yeah, the landlords basically, right? So
Yeah.
I think they make the British monarchy makes money from renting the cottages, houses, they have
Castles, things like that.
tenants, yeah, and yeah, and if people use it like corporations, for instance, they throw some kind of party, and then maybe they rent that space, they pay money to the monarchy. So yeah, that's a big way. I mean, being a landlord, it's a money generator for the British monarchy. But within the Austrian context, yes, I think that if you
Vienna,
go,
especially, right? Don't they have a lot of maybe a
yeah,
castle?
Vienna. So you have Belvedere, you have Schönbrunn,
Salzburg?
and then you have Hofburg, right? So that Hofburg was the center city. The others are a little bit further afield, but you can reach them easily by public transportation. And actually, I mean, so when I was there in Vienna, like this past summer, I always make sure that I visit all of the castles. So I always go to Schönbrunn at least once, because you can go up that. It's like a hill basically, and they have this beautiful garden, like with flowers and everything. And then of course they have these beautiful castles. And then when you go on top of the hill, then you sort of have a good overview over parts of the city, right? Because you're at the top of the hill, and then and because the castle is at the bottom of the hill, so you can kind of see it from the distance too. So it's very beautiful. And then I do the same thing in Belvedere. I go to the Hofburg.
Oh, wow.
I mean, yeah, I go
Quick,
to
quick,
Stephansdom. Yeah.
quick question. I'm curious about Austria, and maybe it's very similar of how it is in Bavaria. Does the state manage the castles themselves, and they collect the fees, and then they also use it to hire people and maintenance? So it's like a state agency that runs it. Is that the case in Austria, or is it a private? Is it privately uh, some kind of corporation that does it, or is it more of like a state agency? Do you know? I'm putting you on the spot. The reason why I bring this
Yeah, I
up
didn't
in
research that, to be
yeah,
honest. So I
in
mean, I'm not gonna.
Bavaria, what happened was, all of this was expropriated like after uh, a lot of it like after World War I, but it slowly went in the hands of the state. And so the monarchs that were still alive and their families, some of them, like in the case of Ellingen, I think until 1950s, lived in the castle in a certain section, but the state actually took over ownership over the building. You could in Ellingen, it's very interesting. It's like uh, a significant royal kind of palace, if you like. I actually visited it. It was really interesting. But the state took it over and then turned it into a state-like agency, kind of like you think of a zoo, like, and they have name tags, and I can't remember the name, but Schlossverwaltung, I think. But it's like a new sector. It's like it creates for the state revenue, and then they can hire people to do the lawns, and do maintenance. And so for the state, it's also a moneymaker. But this is where it's different from the UK, right? In the UK, those castles and the money that's made off of it goes back into the crown estate, and so that directly also benefits the royal family in the case of the king. Whereas the money that's earned from castles in places like at least Bavaria and most of Germany goes back to the state, and then the state can use it, to maintenance of the castles or other decisions. That's interesting. That makes it different from Germany, if you think of it, and the UK. UK really sort of puts that money back into the pockets of the royal, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I think in Austria, but it's probably also going to be state run. I mean, I
yeah,
would be very surprised that if they would farm it out to private sector. I mean, I think there's elements within the tourism economy in the inner city that obviously are private. So one example would be, like these bus tours, right?
yeah.
Like
Those are for profit, right?
yeah, these are for profit private. And then also another thing that's special to Vienna and maybe some other culturally oriented cities is like concerts, like music concerts. Like they would sell you, like what they say, oh, these are discounted tickets, and then you can listen to like a Mozart concert. Yeah, like it's about an hour long or so. And it's also part of the tourism economy, right? And that's almost surely private, right? So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
interesting.
but I think the buildings themselves, I think the buildings are probably state owned, right? Yeah,
Yeah, for the most part.
yeah, that would make a lot of sense. Yeah.
Oh, that's a
So
good
where
point.
do we want to go next? I mean, so
It's up to you.
so
Oh, it doesn't. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, the thing that I shared obviously recently about the energy situation in Europe, I think it's it's an incredibly serious situation right now. And as the time goes by, I think we see more and more of that. Um, and so the energy price situation has been very challenged, even as we were coming out of the acute phase of the pandemic. Because if you remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, the people stopped traveling and they stopped buying things, so that reduced demand for oil and gas, which runs our economy at this point. And then when the economy started to recover, I want to say second half of last year, that's when you saw the gas prices and the oil prices starting to increase, because it takes time to revamp the capacity for energy infrastructure. Basically getting the tankers out of the storage facilities, filling them up again, and then also, you know, drilling, opening up the drilling operations again. So as all of that takes time, and so you have this demand and supply mismatch, right, where demand outpaces supply, and then the price goes up. So that was a story, I think, up until February, right, and then you have the Ukraine invasion, and everything seems to be messed up right now because the Europeans are doing sanctions, right, against the Russians. The Russians are the biggest energy exporters in that region, so they have to redirect the flow to China, to India, and Southeast Asia that don't participate in those sanctions. Um, and then the Europeans, they purchase at higher prices both oil and gas.
Mhm.
And yeah, so they're able to afford these higher prices, so they're basically pushing out Asian countries that can't pay as much. So the Asian countries, they are hobbled in their economic recovery because they can't afford the higher global energy prices. Um, and and the Europeans are paying much more right now.
Significant, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I listened to German television. They invited a bunch of people that were uh, basically having to announce shutdowns of the shops, right? Shops that have been running for a long time.
Bakeries, I think.
Yeah, bakeries. I mean, if the prices go up 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, uh, and then very soon, yeah, you can't operate your uh, business anymore, and you can't pay the creditors. So this is a very deep mess. And then recently, there was a speech in the Bundestag with Sarah Wagenknecht, um,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
and she was promoting a ceasefire, effectively, and negotiations with Putin to basically restore the gas contract.
Hmm.
Because right now, basically, the Russians are saying, you have to lift the sanctions and we'll give you the gas, right? And then the Europeans are like, no, we're not gonna lift the sanctions because you have to withdraw from Ukraine, and of course the Russians are not going to do that. Um, and Right, so the voices already are saying, hey, in Germany, it's like, we have to fix our own domestic economic problems, right?
It's, but definitely in an energy war. And I think Putin realized that, and he's, you know, realpolitik. I mean, he's using that to get whatever he can, to use it as a tool. And for Europe, the rest of West Europe, there's unintended consequences because of war, right? And you're right. I mean, politically, even internally in Germany, there's a fighting between, the right, the middle, the center, and the left, or SPD or CDU. And I kind of see the same thing occurred in the US when there was gasoline price. There was a big split between people blaming it on Biden, and there may be more to the right side of the political spectrum. And then to the left, people were blaming it on global warming, and we need to, go away from fossil fuel anyways. So I think if you look at it through the perspective of Germany, it's because you also have, a kind of, well, you have a green environmental minister. He's environmental, and I don't know what they call
Economy,
it, in
economy.
foreign minister. So it already upsets people on the right, the fact that you have those two people in there, and that's, because they're now the representative of government. But yeah, that there's a lot of tension. And don't get me wrong, I think Putin understands this. Putin knows that there's internal conflict happening anyways. So he comes from a position of a realist. I think he's a realist. I think he knows that he can probably gain some points, or he can leverage it. And the unintended consequence is that the people who will suffer the most, at least in the West, are low income, and those that can't, they need it. So, like, I think heating is a big issue right now throughout Europe, and how you're going to solve that. So there's a problem of people stealing wood again, apparently, and people are trying old methods to try to keep warm in the winter because of the reliance on natural gas, through, or the oil gas pipeline, Nord Stream 1, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question. I mean, whether green energy projects are necessarily the issue here. I mean, I think the bigger issue was that we don't have enough of it, right? And that's the reason why we are so reliant on Putin's whims. The fact that the country was slow in promoting alternative energy, solar, wind power. I mean, like, there's a lot of investments in the recent past, and the way how the Germans were, formulating it was, the energy strategy was to say, okay, we're going to shut down nuclear energy because we think nuclear is not safe. Look at Fukushima, look at Chernobyl, look at 3 Mile Island, right? But nuclear is a low carbon energy source that produces a lot of electricity. So that was a big trade-off that the government under Merkel was making. And they were saying, okay, but we're also going to go out of coal. So, we're going to shut down the coal plants, and which sustained, the rural area in like northwest Germany. And okay, so you're shutting down these two energy sources, but then you don't have enough renewable energy. So what do? So you go to gas. And then gas, the cheapest way to acquire gas is through the pipeline, and the pipeline connects to the Russian suppliers. And now the question was like, okay, why did the Germans, for instance, not build pipelines that connect, with other suppliers? Like, let's say a pipeline to Norway going through the North Sea, right? Because the Norwegians have a big gas deposit. Then there's Azerbaijan, so you have to go through Georgia and the Black Sea and Turkey. or like a south-north connection through the Mediterranean, because I think Algeria and some of like the Morocco, maybe like West African states have gas deposits. Another possibility in Niedersachsen in the northwest, there's fracking gas, which the government ultimately rejected because of the environmentalist protests. And I think it's only the CDU right now on the merits. I think they're in favor of or at least they want to debate, the issue of fracking.
Well, FDP, the neoliberals, they kind of also want to open the nuclear power question. So yeah, you're totally right. It's a big mess. On this, I actually take the position of Ulrike Hermann. I don't know if you ever heard of her.
I
she
know
was
her
also
very
on
well.
Marcus
I listened to a
Lanz.
lot of
You heard of
her.
her? She was also on. She was on a talk show, and she comes from this green left kind of position, if you
But
like.
she's also very smart. I mean, you always notice that, like with the other guests, and then she always gives like a 15-minute lecture.
Did you see the podcast? They were talking about the whole issue of what to do, and she as an argument, she goes in the same direction, kind of, about we need to reduce how much we're consuming. We need to reduce our behavior, and that is the core problem. We need to
right. So her terminology was
circular economy, or maybe stationary kind of economy. I don't think she actually used those words, but
grüne Schrumpfen, right, which means
schrumpfen,
green shrinking, basically.
So and it fits into vegetarian kind of thinking too. But people sometimes, say in Berlin, I think Kreuzberg, it's a more left kind of ecological utopia, if you like. It's ride your bicycle everywhere you can. Actually encourage bicycle riding, cargo bicycles. Structure your communities so that you're not so dependent on these natural resources. Reduce automobiles. And I think the argument that she makes, and I will make, that in the US it's very clear that the cars are too many. There's just too many cars, and we have to reduce. And then if we reduce cars, then we have more, fuel, anyways. But the another idea is saving. We have to learn how to save of what we do, and our, energy costs, and the necessity to keep. There's a high demand on our energy. So the idea is to reduce the demand on having so much energy in the first place. So it's energy, and our dependency on it, we have to shrink it, right? We have to reduce it, go a little backwards. And then people criticize it. They say, well, you're thinking, you want to go back to the Middle Ages? You're going to turn off, lights. But actually, that's what sometimes in Germany, they start to turn off unnecessary lighting in the cities now, to prepare and to acknowledge that we have to reduce how we use our energy, including the light bulbs that we use, or as whenever possible, we go solar and go in that direction. That, again, I guess that's a lifestyle, but also it's very political,
But
it makes some people may be upset.
Accomplish a minimalist economy, right? That is to say that, so it's not just like about riding a bicycle, but I mean, you think about the implications that it has on investment and jobs, right? Which, I mean, if you go back to this, Weberian terminology of legitimation, right? What is it that legitimates, a certain political economy, a certain social system, social economy? And our capitalistic economy says that legitimacy comes from full employment, from having enough jobs for everybody. And then the full employment itself comes from investment, right? From the private sector, right? And then the investment from the private sector comes from, credit. I mean, that's finance. It's a big part, but but ultimately it comes from economic growth, right? So you have to grow the economy, um, because that creates the rate of return for the investors, um, and then as long as the investors are investing in the economy, that's when you can have full employment, right? And then as long as people have full jobs, then you can keep the cycle going, and you don't have too many losers in the process. And that's the legitimation of our current system. And what Herman and others are sort of thinking about is basically to shift the legitimation to more basic survival outside of the commodity economy. So I mean, if you think broader than just bicycles, I mean, there would have to be some changes to the food system, right? That, for instance, being able to grow local food that you don't have to transport really to really far places. Whether it's organic food or not, I mean, I think that's to be debated, because I think organic food, doesn't produce, high enough quantities to feed everybody, right? Society. So I think we'll probably need some fertilizers that have carbon impact inevitably, but yeah, I mean, but if you were able to produce locally and you have short transportation routes, and also you try to decommodify that, right? For instance, by giving out food stamps to everybody, for instance, or if you organize the healthcare system based on like a public system, like a single payer healthcare system, right? Or with the transportation, I mean, you could maybe making it free is difficult, but making it very cheap, like making public transit very cheap, very easily accessible. Yeah, so you would have to redesign the social systems to be, non-profit generating and able to, take care of people's economic needs outside of the commodity sphere.
So like a sustainable society, something that's sustainable in itself and circular,
Yeah,
or moving away from a for-profit that the for-profit idea is also problematic. That it's just profit, and
yeah,
then
because
in
profit
itself,
relies on growth, right? And growth
right?
relies on burning fossil fuels, at least historically, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's definitely. I'm thinking the same way like you're thinking. What's always fascinating, I mean, I don't know. This must be big in Austria. I know it's big in Germany. And this local farming kind of movement, and people have these little lots between the railway stations. I don't know if they have that in Austria, but in Germany, there's this idea that you could, create food and a decommodification of that, you don't have to just buy it in a supermarket, or you could buy it from your farmers. So in some Bavarian towns, I remember when I visited in May, you can go up to a farm and get some milk directly from the farmer. So there's a direct impact on the local economy, instead of having it, purchasing it at a big supermarket. And
they
uh
would give it to you in like the glass
yeah,
bottles, and then you return it back to them.
exactly. It's actually a circular economy. That's what I would describe it. It got, it benefits the local area, and then there's some benefit that it stays organic, and then that they're not put. At least you hope they're not putting chemicals in the cows, so that you get the chemicals when you drink the milk. But I also noticed in Europe, you've probably seen this. There's a vegetarian kind of movement, and so people even bake their own bread frequently. So something I recognized as long as I've lived in Texas is there's a scarcity of bakeries, surprisingly. And everything is like a massive industrial bakeries that mass produce this cheap loaf of bread. And I could never get a good, decent bread in Texas. I still can't. So here, last 6 months, I've been practicing baking my own bread. But that could be an option. I mean, bakeries that are local, that are maybe co-ops, a little co-op movement. And that could at least, prevent this big giant retailers that swallow up everything, and, profits that go upward instead of downward. And
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
just recently saw a study, I mean, about the fertilizers. I mean,
yeah.
so glyphosate is a very common herbicide that is used to basically, kill the weed on, like farms, crops, and it's about increasing productivity for food production, and it's been found in more than 80% of urine samples
That's crazy.
in the US.
Crazy.
And and it's a herbicide that's also linked to
That's
cancer.
industrial farming, yeah, for you. Industrial farming. If you got to mass produce it, and the negative side is that chemical use and mass production. So it has, some people say it has benefits because you're mass producing, and then you can, thousands of loaves of bread, or even a giant milk
that was my
dairies.
thought, right? Because if you have 8 billion people, I mean, we're going to hit that
Yeah.
level very, very soon.
Yeah.
And people talk about, we need organic farming and shit like that. I mean, which is great. I mean, but it's like I want to know the exact numbers. Like, if you count together all of the people that eat, let's say, more than 80% of the diet with organic food, right? What percentage of the total global population is that? I mean,
how much it can feed, you mean? How much it can feed?
Exactly, that's right. I mean, how many people can you feed?
I'm gonna use a different example. I've never really looked at it this way until I started becoming critical of bottled water, right? In the privatization, sale of, you can say, commodification of water, and it's a massive industry, and it really just taps into a natural resource, puts it into a bottle, and then charges it like it's a gasoline price. And that's something we allowed to happen, over time, and we allowed this sector to grow, where bottled water, not just blaming soft sodas companies, but there's this natural resource we all know we get from Mother Nature, right? And then all of a sudden there's this money-making aspect that's created off of water. And then we have a problem where people, can't afford this luxury, or there's a scarcity of it. But there's actually sometimes people that make money off of it. I mean, corporations could make money off of it, or there's entities that could make money off of it, precisely because there is a scarcity of it. And not and so that's sometimes concerning, especially here in the South, and even other states. They have, real water problems, with some areas.
Was it in Jackson, Mississippi, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There was some kind of, what was it, like a hurricane, or there was some
it was flood, no, mass flooding,
event,
flash flooding to where it over
and it affected the treatment, the water treatment plant, right?
Yeah. And basically, like, the argument was that the Mississippi state didn't invest in, updating the water systems, and they never really thought about this as a public good. Rather, the state of Mississippi thinks of it as a private entity that you should be able to make money off of. And because you don't treat it then as a public good, then you have all these problems, because you keep thinking that you can make money off of it. And again, it's a financialization of a basic natural resource, that we take for granted, and Mother Nature gives to us, and now it's up for grabs.
Right. And then obviously, if you're in Jackson, I mean, you have the state that then comes in and they supply bottled water to the residents of Jackson, while they're trying to figure out how to fix the water treatment plant. and restore the water access. But there's been a lot of criticism there. I mean, it's very high African American percentage, high poverty percentage in the population, and there's insufficient amounts of investment in maintenance, because I mean, you could argue that if they had invested a couple $1 million to update the water treatment plant, then even in the flooding events, I mean, the water would have continued to function, I guess, operate. The fact that these investments were not done meant that it was very fragile. And now, basically now that the thing is broken, I mean, you'd probably be spending way more money on, doing it over again.
Definitely a manufactured risk, right? Classic example of a manufactured risk, I would say.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if you remember the Flint, Michigan water crisis that happened, also the same thing again, high African American, high poverty percentage in the population, and there was, I think, a drive to privatize the water supply, and then and then basically there was a crisis manager, I think, because there was a fiscal crisis where basically the city didn't have any money, so the state stepped in and appointed the emergency manager, and that emergency manager was finding ways to cut the budget. So they decided to cut the water budget, and the way to do that was to shift the water supply from the basically clean water source to the polluted water source. And that was a way to save money, and then you had the lead poisoning, I think, among a lot of the kids. So you have like developmental deficits in the brain for a lot of kids. So they have trouble speaking and learning properly, and and then the state had to clean it up. They had to fix that afterwards. And then President Obama went to Flint, and he gave a speech, and then he was like, "Oh, I'm very thirsty. Give me a glass of water." And then
you make it,
he was just like a stunt. He was asking for a glass of water.
Yeah.
And he was given that, and he was taking like a really small, tiny sip from the glass, where it was almost like, okay, I know that this water is polluted,
but
I want to make it seem like, like if the president drinks it, right? If the king drinks it, then
it must be okay.
It must be okay. Yeah, that was the sort of reason.
If I remember the criticism when he did that, later people argued also that this represents this neoliberal Democrat, that Obama really was neoliberal, and that on the environmental issues, he didn't go to the left. He went to the right sometimes. And so that is maybe the legacy of maybe even going far back as Clinton, this neoliberal democratic kind of agenda, which very different. Well, if you think of the Democratic Party itself, legacy of being neoliberal oriented, that's a critique. So it's a big criticism one could make. There's one more thing I was trying to think of I could add here. I lost my thought. So there was one more thing I wanted to add. Now I forgot it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, the environmental issue, I think, is one of the biggest that we have to face. Because if you think about the bad weather events that seem to keep happening, I mean, there was right. I mean, the flooding the water, so not just in Mississippi, but we have this big storm now in Puerto Rico, and they lost power everywhere recently. Now I saw there was another big storm that's like a typhoon that hits Japan, and apparently they evacuated 9 million people from the southernmost island, which is a lot of people. And of course, it's going to knock out the power and everything. And then when people are, coming back after the storm has settled, I mean, are they going to find habitable houses? It's a big question. When they had these big floods in Pakistan and the Sindh province in the south, where the main river was just overflowing, and it impacted 30 million people. Over 1,000 lost their lives, but you have to consider, I mean, for those that survived it, the many people that survived it, sure, you can physically survive the flood event, but then your house is in complete disrepair. You probably, maybe, I mean, if it's like a weak structure, it was probably completely torn away by the floods.
No, it's a good observation that it suffering more the global south, and in the global north, we take it differently and we analyze it differently. And I think this reflects this asymmetry of development between the global south, and whenever this environmental crisis that hits them, it's disaster. And I think in my dissertation, one of the topics that I looked at is Lagos, Nigeria, which there's squatter settlements that exist on the riverbeds, and also by areas that are high risk impact areas of flooding. So whenever we have these floodings, it's these informal settlements that get hit hard. And precisely because it's unregulated, and they're built really weak structures. They're often just makeshift kind of places. And all throughout the global south, there, if you think of even the favelas in Brazil and in India, Mumbai, the slums, informal settlements. Whenever there's flooding, it impacts those informal settlements significantly, and especially severely, because deadly. Just imagine you have those flash floods. It goes through an informal settlement anyways, with bad foundation kind of stuff. So but the way I would explain this is, in the West, we kind of externalize our problems away psychologically. So global warming, I think, amplifies the problem as a global problem, but we again go back to a kind of nation state frame, I would call it. Like we treat it, even in the social sciences, by the way. In the social sciences, we're taught, like as sociologists, or if you're a political scientist, we got to look through it through a nation state perspective, and we national data, that we kind of study. But when you ever have problems like global warming, we know it's international. Actually, it doesn't care what boundaries exist, and Mother Nature, when it wants to do damage, it's going to do it. But in the global south, it has more severe consequences, right? But I think in the different areas of the world,
because you have fewer resources to dig yourself out of it.
Exactly. But I think there's something psychological. Like in the global north, it's treated like a political debate, when it comes to issues like global warming, and you take a left position or you take a right position, and it's kind of an educated talk, I would say, but it's an issue of survival in the global south. It's no longer an intellectual talk. It's not like an academic thing anymore. I mean, it's real life death, and
but that's happening in global north too now.
They're slow to catch on. I think they're slow. There still is not like enough consciousness raising. I think they're still kind of thinking, these are intellectuals, and they're all scaring us, and and maybe their
if you look at the
academics.
floods last year in Germany in the summer, right, and the
Yeah.
Ahrtal, along the Rhine River, I mean,
Oh yeah, that was
it
big.
just completely, blew up, blew away these houses along the riverbank. And then if you look at the headlines this summer, it was the drought. I think that was the big concern where, um, yeah, I mean, I noticed it myself. I mean, I was in Vienna, I guess most of July, and it was not raining a single time that I was there. I mean, about 3 weeks or so. Um, and it was very sunny. It was very warm too. Um, and it was only this year that I started reading up about the changes in the Atlantic meridional ocean circulation, and also like the changes in the jet stream,
Mhm.
which is caused by basically rapid warming in the poles, both the North Pole and the South Pole, but particularly the North Pole. And what it does is if you have less temperature differences between the pole and the equator, then instead of having a stable jet stream that goes west to east in a straight line, and to keep the cold air in the north and the warm air in the south, you basically have these like waves in the jet stream. So within the same, I guess, latitude, you could have one area that's extremely cold, and then you can have another area that's extremely hot. Um, yeah, because these wavy patterns are sort of, shifting the hot and cold regions within the same latitude.
Mhm.
And even worse than that, it's about trapping these systems too, right?
Hmm.
So you could trap, like a cold low, which usually means precipitation, rain. So you have extreme rainfall events that causes the flooding, right? And it takes days and sometimes even weeks in order to break up that weather pattern. And then in other locations, you have like high and heat, right? So then it means that it's usually dry heat. So you basically have uh, like a heat wave, and then the heat wave then takes weeks, and then if it stays there, then you have the opposite problem where a lack of moisture,
Yeah.
the rivers drying up, the lakes drying up, and then the update that I saw, I shared this on my profile too, about hydropower, which provides, I believe, 2/3 of the energy supply of Austria. Um, it's a big part of the renewable energy strategy of the Austrian government. Um, Hydropower has been there for a long time now. I mean, because mountains and lakes, right? And then you have these valleys, right? And then you can build, hydropower plants. Now I read that it's pretty much built up, the entire region. There might be a few spots in Tyrol where you can still add new hydro plants. It's not just not enough, the capacity and not enough extra space to build it, but also if you have a drought season, which we have right now, then the hydro power plants, they cannot operate, right?
Hmm.
Because
Oh,
the energy comes from the water streams, right?
oh, yeah. It
Yeah, so I
relies
mean,
on the.
if you don't have the water coming in, you can't generate the energy, right? Um, and so it was
Are
on
they
the
actually trying? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are they also trying in Europe, like hydro powered trains? I believe.
it's
And
hydrogen, right?
What?
Hydrogen.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Hydrogen. Yeah, different. Sorry, confusion. Yeah. So you're saying with water scarcity and that you can't produce then
The
energy from
electricity through hydropower. Yeah,
hydrogen
that's right.
powered plants,
Yeah. Yeah.
energy plants.
And I saw
Yeah.
the French, they had similar issues with their nuclear power plants.
Not enough water.
Yeah, because so you always built the nuclear power plants along rivers,
Lakes. Yeah.
or lakes, yeah, around the coast or whatever, because I think because you have the easy access to the water in that region, that you then use to cool the plants, right? Because there's some chemical reaction where, you know, basically you have to always keep the balance between like the heat
Equilibrium.
that the
Yeah.
fusion that the fission causes, and then you cool it down with the water, right? That sort of thing. And because they had this massive drought in France, I mean, it was like, I mean, in Vienna, I mean, it was like maybe 35 Celsius, maybe something like that in the summer, which would be about 90, 95, something like that. Right. I mean, if you go to the like south of France, where they had this real heat wave that was really stuck there. It was like over 40 degrees, 45 degrees, I think, Celsius. So it's about more than 100, right? So lakes and rivers completely dried up. They were shutting down the nuclear plants. And that to me was like, okay, I go back to this Ulrich Beck, this risk society concept, because
Yeah. Favorite
uh,
book. That's a good book to read.
yeah,
Actually, World Risk
it's
Society is good too. World Risk.
yeah, because
Yeah.
you see,
I got
okay,
that in my
so
collection.
right, so think about one of the adjustments that we would be making if it gets hot outside in the summer, right? So
Mhm.
our first reaction, would probably be to say we want to crank up the AC, right? So if you want to crank up the AC, well, and of course it's going to run really hard when it gets really hot, right? So you need the electricity. So you have, but then if it gets extremely hot outside, then it means that it overtaxes the energy grid, right? The energy grid has a harder time operating at extreme levels of heat because the infrastructure, I think, is set up to work at basically moderate temperatures, I think, right? So you have from there you have the threat to the electric grid through the heat itself. And then the other thing is, well, okay, we don't want to burn more fossil fuel in order to operate our air conditioning units. So we're going to have to do renewable energy. Now, I mean, so, or, so the hydropower is one, but I just said, okay, what if you have a drought? And the same thing with the nuclear energy is not renewable energy, but it's a low carbon energy source. But you can't run it, if you have an extreme drought, right? So then what do you do? I mean, so what the Europeans they've been doing is they restarted their coal plants. So they put the coal plants back online. And I mean, the nice thing about coal plants is that it's kind of like you can pull it out of the drawer, right? And then you just feed coal into it. You burn the coal, and then you get the energy, right? So it's a very nice feature about coal.
Mm.
Just at the point of usage. Now, I mean, obviously, in terms of the carbon impact, it's probably the worst thing you can do.
Mm.
But in terms of quick access, quick energy, it's probably the best you can do, easiest you can do.
Mm.
Yeah, and then you still need probably oil and gas, right? I'm not sure how the oil and the gas plants are affected by the heat. I mean, I haven't seen too much about negative news from there, but that's one of the things that concern me, right? Where it's like if it gets too hot, then some of the energy sources that the low carbon are not working.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to bring back Ulrich Beck. I think you were trying to mention this ultimate direction towards risk. And I think I read, several times Ulrich Beck. He also was a realist, and he said nature is the new utopia. And he, was very careful not to sound like he was fundamentalistic or he had this utopian view of what we could do about environmental problems. But one thing I did learn from his writings, he's very careful to make differentiation between what he calls first modernity and second modernity, and natural risks and manufactured risks. So he's very much a Weberian thinker in that regard, how our rationalization changes and how we get, directly impacted through technology, science, as a form of rationality, right? Now, one thing he talks about in the original Risk Society book, which I think is fruitful for our discussion, is he says in the shift towards modernity that there's a dictatorship movement away from it's a movement towards dictatorship of scarcity, right? He actually uses that word, dictatorship of scarcity, right? And that increasingly even politics influences what scientists can study, and there's overlapping between funding and public knowledge, and what use can it have, or who decides who has the monopoly of truth. I don't think he uses that phrase, by the way, monopoly of truth, but all of this often is manufactured risk. That the idea is that we have, as humans, created a lot of the world's problems. There's also things in nature, in the natural cycle, we can blame it on, but we make policy, we make governance, we make decisions, and that's a form of consequence, that explains why he uses that word risk society frequently. And then he uses that world risk society. It's a world risk society. So it's not just a nation state kind of principle, but now he's saying it's a global chaos, if you like. What I've done in some of my classes sometimes, because I sometimes assign just a little bit of that book towards the very end, if I get to it, I ask people, okay, now that he told you that this is a risk society, what do we think of as a post-risk society? How would a post-risk society look like? And that's where people have difficulty explaining for them even what would be the best environmental friendly, or that's where people have difficulty. It's the critique is easy. I think the criticism is easy. Any person can make criticism and define risks, but Ulrich Beck, that was always a thing. His whole method was around this concept of risk, but the idea of what a sustainable post-risk society would look like was actually very weak. And towards the last few years of his life, he did start to talk about possible pathways, including what he called green modernity. He called it green modernity, one of his articles he wrote. And then he also went into this cosmopolitan kind of vision book. He wrote that one. But that was about it. I don't, so that my question is, again, what would a post-risk society look like even? That's my question. Maybe
Yeah, it's a complicated questions. I was thinking of another reading by Charles Perrow. And he is an organizational scholar, and he was also thinking along the lines of risk society, and he analyzed the problems in 3 Mile Island, the nuclear plant in Pennsylvania in the 1970s. And he came up with, sort of like two concepts. The one is complexity and the other is coupling.
Okay.
So complexity is basically, how many parts are there to, I guess, operate 3 Mile Island, the nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of parts in order to functionally run a nuclear plant. And then the concept of coupling is basically how dependent are these parts onto each other, right? That is to say, like if there's low coupling, it means that the parts are independent from each other, right? So I don't know. So if I overeat and gain weight, this should have no impact on you because presumably maybe you're not following my bad example, that sort of thing. But in the nuclear power plant, yeah, there's a lot of coupling, right? Where basically, if the one thing doesn't work, I mean, it could affect the operation of the entire plant, right? And so if you wanted to use this Pero paradigm, I think what it would mean is if we wanted to be less prone to have like a nuclear risk, a nuclear accident in a major way, for instance, we would have to be able to design systems that are simple, right? That say, they don't have a lot of different parts. Yeah, if think of like a bicycle instead of a combustion engine vehicle or even an electric vehicle, right? Where it's like there's like all of the parts in the bicycle you can kind of see and touch, right? I mean directly, right? Like the chain and the pedal and the wheels, right, and so forth, right? So that would be simple, right? It's a simple thing. Much simpler to repair than, let's say, an engine in the car. And let's design systems that are decoupled. That is to say, where the failure of one doesn't cause the collapse or the failure of the other parts in the system. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out as sort of a conceptual.
What was his name again? So maybe our listeners can do some research.
Charles Pero.
What's the title of some of his works? You have to check, but it'd be interesting. He's an environmental sociologist, or
no? He's an organizational sociologist.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like
it sounds very close to Luhmann's systems theory. And there's a lot of followers of Luhmann, and actually even in Germany there's several followers, sociologists.
The two main titles are normal accidents and complex organizations.
Complex organizations, yeah. I think Luhmann also uses this phrase of complexity, system complexity. And I have seen it used as a concept, listening into some talk shows, and I try to make sense of it, how I understand it myself. But the way you describe coupling and decoupling, now it makes sense to me. But like the way people sometimes use the phrase complexity in modern systems and this excessive functional differentiation, right? If you borrow terms, not just from Durkheim, he used it too, but Luhmann really uses this concept several times, just to let you know where the theoretical origins is of this. I don't know. I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong. By the way, Beck also uses a lot of Luhmann in his Risk Society book when he talks about this functional differentiation. So where am I going with this? How would this be useful if you're trying to really make sense out of this? And how would you use it, to use sociological knowledge to understand complexities in the modern world, that the systems that we have created are so complex, like you say, it's like chaotic and the systems don't align well. And that's exactly the notion of risk, right? Increasing complexity means more risk, and our institutions is a lag. They can't keep up with often this radical change, and they're still stuck in this lag. And that could explain sometimes the failure of state institutions to recognize risk. It takes them too long to counter-react. And a good example is the case of Chernobyl. People often blame, state bureaucracy or this political thing of hiding risks or not being honest and really holding knowledge hostage. And that is an example also of risk, right? The different institutions that may have political interests, to keep it a secret or to keep it away from public knowledge, right? So,
Yeah, I
but that's
mean,
also together with complexity. Complexity means also communication is very complex. I think one of the points that Beck often made in his books is the communication that we use to describe risk is very, very complex, and a person can confuse people, or maybe it's so technical in nature that that it also adds to risk. And I remember one in the World Risk Society. He had this long passage. If I remember the page number, I don't remember, but he was asking the question, like, who ultimately pays when people mess up, and who do you write the complaint letter to? And I think he was meaning like it would go to different departments and it would have to circulate to different sub departments. By the time it actually got to the right authority, that's already too late. And that we have created complex systems, too complex systems, and they can't kind of keep up with, communication or adjusting whenever whenever we need adjustment, right?
yeah, and
That's
also,
why I would use complexity as a word. It sounds like decoupling. I like that.
well, I mean, so there's two concepts. It's
Yeah.
coupling is about the interconnection between parts, and then complexity is about how many parts are there in it. If there's too many parts, then it's complex. But and so there's another complication here, which I think has to do with the fact that you and I mean, living as members of modern civilization, we actually don't know what an alternative life looks like and feels like. Because our ancestors, I mean, they were embedded in much simpler social systems. So the hunter-gatherers, they had a small tribe of 150 people, and if you had too much of a conflict with another person, then you might be shunned from the community and you might starve and die or whatever. But I mean, so before it gets to that, you usually try to accommodate somehow. But the fact that there was only face-to-face interaction meant that you could always try to fix that issue before it became too serious. And then also the other concept of hunter-gatherer lifestyle is everybody did everything, right? So everybody was kind of hunting and gathering and doing the other things to survive. And even in the feudal system, I think it's a fairly simple, straightforward kind of structure, where basically on some days of the week you produce food for yourself, and then other days of the week you work on another plot of land, and then the food you produce you gave to your landlord, basically, who owned the land. So still a very, very kind of simple lifestyle to some extent. And what we have done in our bureaucratic world is we keep adding new and new layers in order to run the social systems that we have. Whether it's it could be the tax system, it could be the labor, so the work system, it could be the healthcare system, which is labyrinthine in this country. The energy system. So there's so many systems that we have created, and we're all dependent on it, right? I mean, if somebody came up to you and said, here's a spear and go hunt your food and build your own shelter,
It's simple,
yeah. I don't think most of us would survive that, if we were thrown out into the woods like that. without any prep work. So it's got to the stage where we are living in these interdependent systems, and we are kind of incompetent and blind, and we have to pray that the people in power know what they're doing. The people in power, the people that manage the systems that we rely on. And clearly, I mean, if we go back again to the German energy policy and the European energy policy, they clearly were wrong. But if I was a German policy advisor back in 2005 when they made the original choice about Nord Stream 1, I would have probably advised the German government to do the same thing, right? To invest in the Russian pipelines, because Russia is the biggest country in the world in terms of size, geographically. It has a huge deposit of gas and oil. And the German export economy is based on having cheap input prices on gas and oil. And now, okay, so again, let's look at it geopolitically, right? So I think the implication, what we're going to be seeing, so within the next months, I think the Germans are going to build the LNG ports, the liquefied natural gas.
Liquid nitrogen, right?
Yeah.
No, liquid
gas.
Liquid gas.
Liquefied natural gas. So because it's an extra chemical step, right? Because what you're doing is you're taking the gas, you're converting it into liquid, basically by freezing it. I think that's the chemical processes. And then you can ship it. And then when it arrives at the LNG port, you feed it back into the pipe. Well, I mean, I guess you heat it up again, so it becomes gas, and then you can feed it through the pipelines. So it's an extra step, extra chemical steps that have to be taken. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the price is 3 times higher. So every unit of gas is 3 times higher for the LNG than for the pipeline gas. So what's going to happen? So there's going to be some winners in that system. So in the Qataris, I mean, they're going to sell more gas. They want the 20-year gas contracts. And weirdly, the German government says, "Oh, we only want 5-year contracts because we want to have renewable energy by then, something like that." Mm-hmm. But okay, no, they have to buy the full 20-year gas contract, right? The Americans are going to benefit because they're sending they're also selling more LNG to Germany and to the European countries. And I think the US is going to benefit in another way too, right? Which is because the Americans, I mean, we're using our own gas, right? And because of the fracking revolution, I guess, the fracking innovation, we've been producing our own gas more or less.
Texas too, by the way, has a lot of natural gas.
That's right. Yeah. So that means, if you're an investor looking for an industrialized country to make investments in, and you want to have cheap, accessible gas supplies, I have a feeling that the Americans now have a very decisive, competitive advantage over the Europeans. Now, I mean, how is that going to play out within the next couple of years? I mean, I'm not sure, but it seems to me like, yeah, the competitive position of the Americans is sort of of the Europeans is much more fragile. I mean, but that's something like, Right. So when you made that decision originally about the Russian pipeline gas, I don't think that we could have foreseen that. Now, I mean, if you're Eastern Europe, if you're the Baltic states, if you're Poland, then you're like, yeah, of course, we saw that coming a long time ago, and um, uh, yeah, but I definitely don't take the position of Sarah Wagenknecht. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's like we have to do peace with Putin and whatever else. I mean, I think it's incredibly naive position because there's this assumption that he can sit down with Putin and then we go back to business as usual. I mean, and he just doesn't have any interest in that. I mean,
Yeah.
He wants to be Peter the Great. I mean, that's what he said. I mean, and Peter the Great. I mean, if you want to be that, you have to expand land. I mean, which is such a ridiculous notion because Russia is already the biggest country in the world. I mean,
I was thinking about internally in Russia. What's interesting is also opposition, and there were a series of protests there, but because of this autocratic, kind of system that we have with Putin, uh, I don't think I don't know about a different wave of democratization. I don't know if that's ever possible unless there's something that he's overthrown, or like with the old Soviet system. I really don't know. I'm speculative. So, there's some people that say Putin is an autocrat, and you know, and that's obviously the reason why we have all these problems. He thinks of himself as Peter the Great, right? And there is a democratic deficit in Russia, and they don't have a civil society that can go against a big, strong leader. And yeah, it's part of the problem.
yeah.
Whenever
So
Russia,
it's this issue. Okay, so why was it that you had the protests again? So you had the mass mobilization, which I think the media called it partial mobilization,
Mhm.
um, but I think it's fairly comprehensive. I mean, like right now, it says okay, we need 300,000 men.
Yeah, I saw that in.
But they have a total reserve force of 2 million. So I think, I mean, eventually, I think they're gonna burn through a lot of men because the material, the training that they will get is much worse than what they initially had when they started the invasion. So I think eventually the number of people mobilized is going to continue to go up, and really I think the only limit that Putin has to activate his war machine is going to be domestic opposition. I mean, like, I mean,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
yeah, I mean, will it get to a point where people are saying, okay, I don't want to die for your freaking war? I mean,
There has to
and
be some kind of legitimation crisis, serious. I already see beginnings of that, but I'm not sure, like the political dynamics in Russia. I'm not really sure about. And maybe it's just because there's a propaganda, techniques, and they're very much cut off. So as far as I know, like there's a curtailment of internet too, and oppositional forces that don't
yeah, so
have
this
access.
interview with Greg Uden, he's a sociologist in Moscow, but he actually has an appointment here in Princeton now because
Oh
he's
wow.
he's one of the scholars who fled the country.
So descendant. Yeah.
Um, no, no, I mean, no, no, he's based here now
Oh, it's space here.
because yeah, because he's fleeing his home basically, right?
Mhm.
And so he says that there's three factions in Russian society with respect to the war, right? So you have the liberals who are against the war, you have the war faction, like the nationalists who are in favor of the war, and then you have the disaffected, right? That's the third faction, right? So these are the people that don't speak out politically, right? And like if you ask them in surveys, they probably say that they're for the war, but just because they're are afraid of saying no, right? They're afraid of being punished, and they just don't want to get in trouble with the authorities, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want to fight the war. That's important, right? They just want to be kept under the illusion that the country is not at war, that it's a military operation that's happening, and so forth. And the main point that Yudin is making, I think, is that disaffected are the biggest group, actually. The liberals are the relatively the smaller group, because they're the ones, who stick the neck out and say I'm against the war. But those are the people who have been put in jail already, right? Thousands of people, or they've already fled the country, like Yudin himself. So and so then basically in Yudin's framing, you have a fight between the disaffected and the war faction. And the pro-war faction, they are right now furious about Putin because he's been waiting so long to do the general mobilization. The war faction wants to go all in. They want to throw everything, including, with the threat of nuclear weapons. They want to basically accomplish the military objective, which is to capture Kiev. Which from a military position, it's totally unrealistic, but I think they still have those maximal demands. And then so the war faction is pissed off about Putin, that he had waited so long for the mobilization, and the disaffected faction is now pissed off because their illusion of being unpolitical is being shattered. Right? Because the idea of being unpolitical means you don't have to serve in the war.
And now they have to. Oh, wow.
Well, now they have to, right?
Yeah. So the seriousness, and yeah. You think the effect of the casualties has started to affect people's understanding of the seriousness? I heard they had tens of thousands of deaths already, at least in the Russian side. I know Ukraine also probably has 10,000. We look at the statistics, if it's available. But yeah, maybe that starts to have an effect, the real deaths. And consequential, because of war, families are affected. Like you said, it's disaffected. Now they realize the seriousness of war and the tragedy that comes with war, right? So I don't know. I'm not trying to be cynical on this topic, by the way, but I need to understand it more so I can make better statements.
Yeah, well, so how many people were affected? I think there was over 50,000 Russian soldiers have died, according to the Ukrainian numbers. According to the Russian numbers, there were 6,000 people who died, but it's unrealistic. When the Russians first moved in, they had about 200,000 soldiers. And I think that they probably fed another 100,000 into the battle, so 300,000, and then 50,000 deaths, plus, according to the Ukrainians, another 100,000 that are wounded. So basically, you have maybe 150,000 left who are on the front lines on the Russian side. And they're having to feed many more into the battle. Now what the first line of thing that they were trying to do is they're trying to recruit mercenaries because they're getting paid more money than the soldiers.
From Chechnya, right? Or a variety of areas.
Chechnya, but also different areas. A lot of the Wagner Group militia people are usually former military, so they retired. Then they get basically, retrained. They get a salary boost, and then they're sent to the front line. Another thing they tried to do is to go to prisons.
Oh yeah, I heard of that one.
And they're trying to promise freedom to the prisoners.
I read that in the newspapers. Yeah, that was a serious, brutal move by Putin. Yeah, real brutal.
Yeah, because the idea is that you send in the murderers, right?
Yeah.
Because, if they go on a rampage and in Ukraine?
I'm trying to figure out the mobilization of in the very beginning of war. Was it strictly conscription, or was it voluntary, or was it both? Now it seems to move in the tone of mandatory conscription, and we're going to call up 300,000. So in the beginning of the war against Ukraine, was it strictly voluntary, and some people that were already part of the Russian military? But now is it sounding like it's mandatory? We're forcing you. There's no, you can't opt out of it. Like if you're being pulled up.
Yeah,
in Russia.
that's pretty much it. Yes.
Yeah.
So like I said, at the beginning of the war, you have you see the core military, which is
Mhm.
professional soldiers, the people that signed up for whatever 10-year, 15-year contracts. Those are most of the fighting forces, and then they sent a minority of um, conscripts, conscript soldiers, which officially they're not supposed to fight, but Putin doesn't give a shit. He sends them to the front line anyway.
Mhm.
Or at least they would be, let's say, maybe second row. They would be like supporting like reserve forces, logistics units, and things like that. But then and then he tried to sort of recruit more, and at the beginning, what he could do is he could call on the other military districts.
Mhm. From
And
the
there's four.
large areas of Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have four military districts,
Mhm.
like northwest, southeast.
Mhm.
I think in the beginning it was just like west and north, and then he brought in south and east. But then and he also pulled in the garrisons from elsewhere, like in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. They had soldiers in Nagorno-Karabakh. They had soldiers in Georgia. They had soldiers in Syria. The various places. So they pulled those out
Hmm.
and inserted them into Ukraine. But once all of these forces are getting used up, then you're like, okay. So then it was then they did the mercenaries, the prisoners, the Chechens.
Mhm.
But they're used up too, right?
Mhm.
So now it's moving in the conscription direction, and there's already queues along the border to Finland, Georgia. All of the flight tickets are booked out completely. People are trying to escape the country.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's a very interesting question because this is the third time in the recent Russian history where we saw the mass mobilization. The first time in World War One, second time World War Two, and now it's the third time. And now, okay, the First World War, the Russians lost it. And the Romanovs, again, we go back to the monarchy topic.
Yeah. Good point.
The Romanovs were basically, assassinated. I mean, they were removed from power.
Killed. Yeah.
Bolsheviks came in. Um, and the Second World War, the Soviet Union won the Second World War, right? So now this is the third time that they're doing it. So is the ending going to be World War One, or is it going to be World War Two? This is a historical question we can ask. And my guess, now this is a guess. I mean, I don't think anybody knows what the future is going to be, but is that it's going to be more like World War One, where it's Tsar Putin is going to be toppled at the end of this war, because all he can do is he's feeding more meat into the grinder. The Western countries, the way how they're going to react to it, my guess is that they're going to increase the military shipments to Ukraine. The Americans have done a lot. The UK has done a lot. The Polish, the Germans. So I think that's going to continue. That's going to intensify. And so very soon, I think the numbers, in terms of the number of troops, I think it could over time it could tilt to the Russian side, because Russia just has a bigger population than the Ukrainians. But in terms of the military materiel, I think that Yeah, I don't see how Putin can overcome that gap, because his tank factories are barely producing anything right now, because they need the Western components to build the tanks. He'll have enough oil and gas because his whole country is a gas station, right? So so the fuel won't be the issue, but it will definitely be the material, the rockets, the missiles, the airplanes, the tanks, and so forth. Um, and the Ukrainians, I think they did something very important, I think, in that war, because if you remember the Kharkiv offensive, where before they did the Kharkiv offensive, I actually wrote that I actually predicted that there was going to be a stalemate, and the front lines wouldn't be moving at all. It was a wrong prediction, because a couple of days later, the Ukrainians overran the Russian positions in Kharkiv and
Element
regained.
of surprise, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, like, looking back at it, is like you can see, you can kind of now guess what the Ukrainian strategy was, and it worked, right? Because they basically said, okay, we're going to do counteroffensive in the south, in Kherson. That's what they announced publicly, and Putin fell for it. So he relocated the troops from Kharkiv region to Kherson, where his troops are also bogged down because of the supply lines cut along the Dnieper River. And so he only had light garrisons in the Kharkiv region. And then the Ukrainians built up forces there. I mean, it took them about a month. And then they seized the whole area. I mean, with 4-1 advantage in troops. So but I think so. So Kharkiv offensive doesn't end the war, because a lot of territory is still captured, occupied by the Russians. But I think it's about the psychological game, right?
Definitely psychological. Yeah.
Where basically the Ukrainians are signaling to the European and the Western American partners, if you give us weapons, we're going to win the war. Right? Because I mean, as long as there's a stalemate, I mean, it's very hard to make that case, right? Because a stalemate is a stalemate. I mean, you're not winning it, right?
Nobody's moving forward or backward.
Yeah. So that was what I thought was going to happen. But now, actually, because of the Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians have a credible case now to say, hey, if you give us more weapons, we're going to finish the job. And then so Chancellor Scholz, the German Chancellor, was had a call with Putin last week or so, and now he was insisting there's not going to be peace unless you withdraw completely. Now this is based on the battlefield strength on the Ukrainian side, right? Because I mean, before that, I think the Germans and the French, they were sort of like, eventually we have to negotiate with Putin. So, where it's going to be some kind of compromise where,
a third way option or something.
Yeah. I mean, it's eventually what it will be. It will be like, to Ukraine, it's like, hey, give up some land and then we'll have some peace. I think that's.
And then, Putin's not going to go with that. I don't think he's got his plan already focused.
Yeah, officially he says he wants a Donbass, but I think that's just an episode.
I get this impression he's really Machiavellian. He's a Machiavellian at heart. He's this, whatever it takes, like this whole thing with the prisoners, using them as soldiers, foot soldiers. That's a classic, I guess, Machiavellian kind of realpolitik, method technique. It's sort of has a scent of Stalinism. I mean, or Stalin's techniques, and maybe the last, decade or so, this has also creeped onto the state itself and how it has centralized power and how everything is around Putin, and it's influenced. Again, I'm not trying to just bash the person Putin, but it's like the governance style of Putin. It seems to be very Machiavellian. It's brutal. It's yeah, that's the way I would describe it. What I observe, what I see, and so he, yeah, definitely has that style. So he's focusing on that.
Yeah, I would compare him to like a mafia boss, right? I
Yeah. Okay.
mean,
Mafia.
basically, I mean, the way for him to generate legitimacy inside of the country, it's not what a democratic politician would do. And a democratic politician is like, it's about jobs, it's about the economy. Like you should have more money in your pocket. I think it's oftentimes what it boils down to. But for him, it's more like, you know, yes, you little Russian peasant or whatever worker, you own almost nothing, but you're a Russian citizen, and Russia is great. Russia is, member of the global stage, and we're going to restore the glory and the beauty of the country, and the way to do that is by conquering other countries.
Oh.
And that's how these other people will, the people in the other countries, they will start to respect us again. And that's inherently problematic, kind of reasoning, because if you're a member of the other country, so if you're like a Georgian, or if you're a Ukrainian, or if you're Baltic, you're like, okay, so I have to be the sacrificial lamb so that Putin has legitimacy in his own country.
Hmm.
And that's very destabilizing to the global order. And so what the Europeans are trying to do is they're trying to restore this notion of political stability back into the continent, and the only way to do that is to restore the Ukrainian sovereignty in full, which includes Crimea. And yeah, but then the question is, I mean, how to get there? I mean, there's people who say, well, should NATO have intervened? Should there have been a no-fly zone? Yeah, should the West have gone in? I mean, if they were so serious about retaining the sovereignty of Ukraine, and I think I think the nuclear weapons make all the difference, right? Because I mean, if you think about 1991, the Second Gulf War, right? George H.W. Bush, Saddam Hussein goes into Kuwait. He takes Kuwait, and the Americans made, they had a UN resolution, I think, back then. Not for the Iraq War in 2003, but for the 91, for the Second Gulf War, they had the UN mandate, and they basically wanted to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And I mean, and that was immediate, right? So I mean, the violation of sovereignty by Iraq was immediately punished by the US. And we're not doing that with Russia, even though I mean from the US intelligence agencies, I think they kind of know at this point about the weakness of the Russian army. So I think it would not have been a stretch for NATO, for the American forces to take on the Russian army. But well, it's a risk, right, with the nuclear weapons.
I have this argument. I think really what we're observing is a Cold War 2.0, or at least to an extent to where NATO wants to do it covertly more, and using other, like with the supplies and the tanks and all that. So that's like a Cold War kind of warfare.
Proxy
That
war.
Yeah, it's so it's economic ways, it's support indirectly, or and it's done that way. It reminds me of like when I read about the Cold War. Of course, I lived through parts of it. It seems to be very similar. That's the real intention for NATO, is not to uh, become like an agent, direct agent for Ukraine. Rather, Ukraine, is supported, but again, it's indirect support. Always
Yeah,
wants
and
to.
also, I mean, and it prolongs the suffering. I think that's a
Yeah,
simple piece of it, right? Because I mean, if it's only the Ukrainian army against the Russian army, where the Russians have the initial, numbers advantage, and then over time, sort of the ratio starts to flip because of the NATO weapons flowing in. But it's a very unstable kind of equilibrium, and I mean, if you have full mobilization both on the NATO, Ukraine, and the Russian side, and both sides are willing to um, fight it out, um, we're talking about a conflict that's going to last years, right? Um, and But I still think that eventually that there is an upper hand for the Ukrainian side, and it has to do with not with the numbers, so it has to do with the morale, right?
yeah.
But essentially, I mean, if you are sort of a Ukrainian soldier, um, there's like two ideas that you're defending, right? So the one is like you are Ukrainian, you have a Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian nation state, um, and then you're also and then also democracy. That's the other value, right? Like freedom. We choose our own governments. We toppled our own government actually when twice when we didn't like it. Um, and then the third thing, they're defending the family, right? Because there has been cases, a lot of cases now of rape and pillaging and random killings of civilians.
Yeah.
So
Very barbaric,
yeah, exactly. So I mean, for all of these three reasons, you to protect your family, you protect your homeland, your language, your culture, and then also freedom and democracy. I mean, and that's going to concentrate so much of the morale advantage, right, to the defending side.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, so the factor of instability, therefore, the factor that I think is going to stop the war is the weakness in Russia or the weakness in NATO, right? So I mean, either
Okay.
NATO says, okay, we're tired, like grandma is freezing in the apartment because there's no gas in the winter. The industries are starting to shut down, unemployment is going up. So we can't send any more weapons. So that would be NATO weakness. And then the second, though I would say it's more on the European side, because I think the Americans are less dependent on the Russian energy supplies. But they would rely on low gas oil prices in the world market. So if the world market stays elevated, world market prices elevated, then it could drag down the U.S. economy too. So so it's not complete independence, but I think that the Americans are a little bit more independent than the Europeans are. So it could be NATO instability or the Russian one, which we discussed earlier, which is, are people going to protest the mass mobilization?
Like an internal revolt.
internal revolt. I mean, or maybe they wouldn't do it right now because they haven't fought themselves yet. When because so right now, I mean, you have to understand the Russian army. It's mostly poor people from the poor provinces, right?
Mhm.
If those people, if they're coming back in the body bags to the villages, I mean, there's probably nothing that's going to happen politically.
Yeah.
But right now, I mean, if you say, okay, we're going to pull in from the big cities, the St. Petersburgers and the Moscows, and if you have those people coming back in the body bags and the families living very close to the Kremlin,
Mhm.
I mean, I don't think it will have the same muted political impact. I think that it's gonna be much more meaningful response. And and the thing about authoritarian systems is that, like you see in democratic countries, I mean, like you oftentimes like you're watching like a tragedy unfold, but it's like over a long time period, and it's in many acts. If you go back to the Brits, I mean, like the Brexit, the Brexit war happened in the summer of 2016, and then they did the Brexit like 4 years later, and now they're still debating like the consequences of that, right?
Mhm.
Um, so that's in democracies. It's like it's a tragedy unfolding. You feel like you can't do anything about it, but it's stretched over a long period of time. With authoritarianism, I think what's happening is that it seems very stable. So right now, if you said September 21, 22, um, my prediction is that Putin is going to remain in power over the next couple of years. Right, so that's the sort of thing,
Mhm.
but it could like within like a few months, or even maybe next year or so. I mean, it could flip all of a sudden.
Mhm.
I mean, he could end up like Louis the 16th, right? And the
Possibly, yeah.
gallows, right?
No, I think
Um,
your authoritarian thesis as a stable system. It has this aspect of power control and power, that it's more difficult for democracies to use the military that way. Like Putin has this authoritarian complex or authoritarian personality, if you like, that there's no rule that he can't break, right? In Western democracies, the process of due process and even the use of the military is more restricted. So that's what's interesting, is you really have an authoritarian um, system with Putin as a kind of dictatorship, now showing some of the weak spots of Western liberal democratic system, if you want to put it that way. Yeah,
yeah, but
if you want
I would say
to,
like if you go
or
back to the Bush era, I mean,
yeah.
I would say that the American ability to wage war was very much unhampered, right? Because I mean, especially because you have the trauma of 9/11, right? So and then Bush says, "Oh, we gotta fight back. We gotta hunt down these terrorists," uh, and and he was able to start two wars, right? I mean, very easily, right? And that's in a supposedly democratic country. I mean, where you're supposed to deliberately weigh the options about fighting the war, but the country evidently has not done it because it reacted by affect, by emotion, to the 9/11 attacks.
Do you think
Um,
maybe it was like hyper nationalism, or this enthusiastic nationalism after 9/11 that gave Bush Jr. a free pass? It kind of uh, enabled him to acquire power more, and anybody that opposed the war was seen as anti-American.
yeah,
So,
I got an
and even
approval
even
of
as like there was one
20%.
or two, I think it was one or two senators that fought this, and it was rare, moment of dissent. And I see the same thing with this Russian nationalism. As is a kind of really strong totalitarian kind of nationalism that even goes after the opponents real radically. It goes after the opponents real radically. So, in that sense, it's this mixture of authoritarianism and Russian nationalism, and then you've got this militarism, right? It converges together, right? It's a strong force that is anti-democratic.
This anti-democratic.
So,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
and so I mean, all of these factors. I mean, nationalism, militarism, authoritarianism. I mean,
Mhm.
ultimately, what it boils down to, I mean, in the political sociology sense, I mean, it's about legitimacy again.
Yeah.
It's about like how because I mean, at the I mean, what the end goal is not, Kiev. It's not like a patch of land necessarily. Um, like the territory is kind of the means to an end. I mean, the end, I think, is for Putin to stay in power until he dies. And then to the extent that he created more chaos in the international system by violating borders, is merely the cost that that the other countries had to pay. I mean, it's not his cup of tea. It's not his problem. But I mean, so I think he has gotten to the stage where, so there's definitely not going to be a negotiated solution. I think anybody who says that, I think is a dreamer, right? Because I think that, if you remember, there was a movie, the Untergang, the downfall.
Yeah, the fall. I
Um,
think that was
yeah,
a good class.
Bruno Ganz was
Yeah,
starring as Hitler, I think, right?
yeah. That's an
Um,
interesting
and,
film.
yeah, and so the main scene was like this bunker scene, right, where the German generals were the Nazi generals were standing around Hitler, and they were explaining the battlefield losses and that the Soviet army was entering Berlin. And then Hitler was like, "Yeah, this is going to be okay because because this army is going to counterattack and it's going to save the day, right?" That's sort of,
He was
and then,
imagining things,
yeah, and then
imaginary army. Yeah,
exactly,
but
imaginary army. The
but
general basically
yeah.
said, "We don't have enough troops."
Go ahead.
And then he completely went in rage and flipped out. But and so I guess we can call this like bunker mentality, right? Where it's like,
Yeah, it's
like your army's already.
fatalistic direction too. If I can add one thing to that movie, it's towards the very end, which I always found interesting, and it's actually based on historical, record, that the number of suicides and that the how far this ideology went. I mean, the Nazi ideology, how far it went. People were willing to kill themselves at the end. And the generals committed suicide, even the families with their children. You remember that scene, which apparently is accurate, that I think it was Goebbels, the propaganda minister.
Yeah,
He himself and his children, they all committed suicide
yeah,
because they believed in this Nazi ideology, that if there's no Nazi Germany, there's no future for us. So this is a fatalistic ideology that's very deterministic. There's no other option, right? So I don't want to make a comparison, but that's a good thing you bring up that movie. People have used this metaphorically, that's what may happen to Putin. I mean, Putin may become so paranoid and so believing in this one pathway of a Russian kind of a reemergence of the Russian Empire, that people will commit suicide, and including his closest followers, and because it would be a bunker mentality. So that movie is really instructive. I think that movie, Der Untergang, US is called The Fall.
the downfall. Yeah.
Yeah, if any our listeners would like to watch that film, that may be a prognosis. What may we predict it now here on on YouTube and wherever you listen to us. If we were wrong, a few years later, but either that the fall of Putin will be suicide, will be an uprising of some sort that removes him, or biological death. There's three options there.
Yeah, biological death. I mean, I find it increasingly less likely because
Yeah.
I mean, see, I mean, if you have a natural life expectancy, let's say up until 85 or whatever, so it'll be another 15 years for Putin theoretically.
Yeah.
I don't think the war is going to last another 15 years. I mean, can you sustain that kind of pressure? Even economically. I mean, because if you look at the numbers, I mean, in the first couple months after the invasion, I mean, first the ruble devalued, but then it actually went higher in value than before the war, because the Russians kept selling gas and oil at a discount, at a heavy discount, but they're still making money because of the very high gas and oil prices. But then the latest numbers, the August figures for the Russian government budget actually showed a deficit. And the projected deficit is going to continue to grow larger and larger. And this is a very uncommon thing because normally the Russian budget was always in surplus because they sell so much gas and oil to the Europeans, right? I mean, that's ultimately, I mean, if you think about, characterizing Putin's regime in Russia, I mean, yeah, it's a giant gas station, right? Mafia boss who sits in the gas station, right? And then he buys weapons with the gas sales. And now where they're making less money, and the projection is going to be making even less money, so they're going to have to, go into debt eventually. The Westerners, I mean, the Western countries, the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, etc. They basically stole half of the reserves of the Russian Federation. So, I don't know that it's frozen now. I mean, but maybe they're going to use it to rebuild Ukraine or whatever. So with international transactions, they probably try to do it in gold. They try to force foreigners to convert it to rubles. They try to get the Chinese to bypass the dollar, right? To use the yuan, the Chinese currency, and the Indians to the rupee, the Indian currency. But I mean, but those currencies are not that great because like you cannot use the rupee and buy valuable things in the Western country, right? So it's
let me try at another angle. May sound a little bizarre, but if you use this superstructure and base analogy from Marx, that was often adapted. So the Russian example would be, do you think the collapse will come from the superstructure, the state, the ideology, like you said, legitimacy, right? If there's a crack in there, that will cause this decline, or have them having to withdraw from Ukraine, or the material base being the material infrastructure of Russia, collapsing, and they can't fund material from a material standpoint the war anymore, and oil and gas can only go so far for them for an advantage. But building tanks is another story. So what do you think? I mean, if you had to simplify it, I don't know, you think it's a superstructure that will be the ultimate reason? That could be the state itself, Putin being part of it, the ideology, or you think it's perhaps, we're very predictive here. I mean, something from the material standpoint. Base superstructure analogy. I had to throw that in there. I was thinking that because it sounds like you were making arguments that could go either way. It could be legitimacy or loss of state legitimacy, which means then the ideology cracks and Putin loses legitimacy, and then it's over. Or it could be something on a material level
Yeah, but
Yeah,
both pieces are connected, though, right? Because I mean,
yeah,
it's like, so like, let's say, I
yeah,
mean, hypothetically, like if the economy was doing really well,
yeah.
right? So if there was a way to effectively bypass the sanctions, you keep selling the oil and gas, etc. So then basically the government doesn't have a budget deficit, so they can spend more money on feeding people, and etc. And they didn't have to fight the wars. And another hypothetical, they reversed the mass mobilization, right?
Okay.
In that, I mean, if that world were to exist, which of course doesn't anymore, but if it were to exist, I think that Putin's legitimacy would be high and it would be stable, right?
Hmm.
So it's really by, like, if you remove those pillars, that's
Yeah, pillar.
yeah, that's when Putin's chair will start to shake, and you
Yeah.
will feel the tremble, right? And he cannot suppress it at that point, because I mean, so right now, I mean, it seems to be easy, like even with the general mass mobilization, like you saw small scale protest,
Hmm.
but oftentimes, like when you saw like the videos of it on Twitter or whatever, you can see that there's like 20 people with like the press jacket, and then they have like the camera and the video taping, right? Um, and then there was like two or three protesters,
Hmm.
and then there's like whatever 20 police officers that were capturing these people, right? And then I was thinking to myself, well, okay, so it means that there's not a whole lot of protests, right? Or at least in on the
Yeah.
locations or the videos that I saw, right?
And
Um,
that, from an ideological standpoint, the the state, including Russia, maintains a monopoly of over the truth itself. So ideologically, there's a concentration.
so far,
That's
yes, so
yeah.
far.
Unless there's a
I think that the
disintegration.
temporal element is important, right?
Yeah, unless there's disintegration, unless there's, like you said, legitimacy problems, and then the state starts to lose this monopoly of, over public opinion, and loses legitimacy slowly. So that's I would say that's superstructural. Maybe there's even I'm just hypothetical, like more and more descendants even on Russian TV. Like I was watching this. Uh, I think about a week ago, they actually had on state Russian state TV. They started having journalist people that started fighting about whether Ukraine was a good or bad idea. And believe it or not, there were like two people that started to like, this is a crazy idea. And this is on Russian state TV. This is usually like censored. So it's starting to crack. And I think it's so like you're saying, we can't divide it into just, state ideology and just something economic, but it's a convergence of both, right? It could have some
Yeah,
kind
you
of
need ultimately. I
yeah,
mean, you need the economy, the polity to function well, and
yeah,
then you're gonna
like the
have the
ruble. If it's more and more unstable, and that would be a material explanation. You would say that it's something in the Russian economy that will cause the war
yeah.
to stop.
And also, you have to consider. I mean, we're now talking only about half a year, maybe 7 months of war, and the economic figures are starting to deteriorate, and we can see that now. So, okay, we're going to go through a very harsh winter, definitely on the European side.
Mhm.
But and I want to see by next year. I mean, what the situation is going to be like. Because also, like with this whole mass mobilization thing, I mean, you can play that card once, right?
Mhm.
With the mass mobilization, I mean, then and then presumably the first people that the first 300,000 that he would be feeding to the war, are going to be the people in the most peripheral areas again, who are least likely to protest and put up with resistance. Because the people have money, you can leave the country. They might have already done so. Um, and then, but if he eats through those 300,000 men,
Hmm.
and then he's going to say, okay, well, we need another 300,000, and then I mean, you already see like it's going to then become more and more complicated, right?
Then it's the bunker outcome. I think, I
Yeah,
think then it's just
there's,
fatalistic. Then
there's
it's just a fatalistic outcome. You
yeah,
know, well,
imaginary.
we have three options now. We got the state legitimacy crisis, the some problems with maintaining the monopoly over propaganda, and then you have the materialistic, economic possibility that it's just the Russian economy can't handle it anymore. So then that's the reason why it collapsed. And then the third is the fatalistic outcome where he's in a bunker and he's
The
like that
battlefield.
bunker. Yeah, I mean that could be hypothetical, and maybe we're right or wrong. We don't know. Maybe somebody will listen to this in a year or 2 years.
Well, I mean, I knew I was
Yes.
wrong several times already. I mean, because so
Yeah.
before the invasion, I thought he was not going to do it, and if he was going to do it, I thought that he was only going to hit the Donbass. He was going to take the rest of the Donbass provinces.
Yeah.
And then he was going for Kiev, and then so when he was attacking in Kiev, I remember I put up the Facebook post
Mhm.
on the 24th of February, and I predicted that the Kiev government would fall within a couple of days, and that basically I said that the West should start preparing an
Mhm.
insurgency and basically having guerrilla and a guerrilla army
Mhm.
fighting the Russian occupation. I mean, that was sort of my state of mind, and then but that was obviously wrong because the Russians pulled out of Kiev and they lost the Battle of Kiev.
Yeah.
And then recently, I predicted there was going to be a stalemate, but then there was a Battle of Kharkiv, the counteroffensive. So I was wrong a third time, and
That's okay. We can
uh,
be wrong, we can all
so
be wrong.
so
Do you
that
think there's a possibility for a counter alliance that somehow Putin manages to put together, and that he can do that, bring in a second country? Like he's already tried that with was it Belarus? And he created like a alliance where they
yeah,
could.
he's trying his best. So if you look at
Armenia, isn't it
the
Armenia? What was that one country? No, not Armenia. I'm
no,
sorry.
Armenia is going to turn to the American side because
Yeah,
you
the other
saw
side.
Nancy Pelosi
Like,
was visiting in
yeah.
Armenia, and now recently I saw like pictures on the streets in Yerevan where they're waving American and Ukrainian flags,
Oh,
it was just quite a gut punch for Putin because Armenia was one of the loyal Russian allies.
huh.
But basically because the Armenians are attacked by Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan, the leader was recently shaking hands with Putin. And because basically Putin says he has bigger fish to fry, he has to fight the war in Ukraine, right?
Hmm.
But anyway, so if you look at the United Nations resolution condemning the Ukraine invasion, you would look at the handful of allies that Russia has on its side. So Belarus, Syria,
Iran? No.
Iran, North Korea, Nicaragua, and Cuba, right? So
Mhm.
it's really a handful of countries. The Nicaragua, Cuba, you can forget about them; they're too far away. With Belarus, yeah, he tried to get them to fight the war.
Yeah, they
Because
pulled out, I think. Right? They don't.
yeah, because the combat forces in Belarus are like 10,000 troops, which is very small, and Lukashenko needs his troops to keep order in his own country because there was an anti-government protest 2 years ago, if you remember, that was brutally crushed because he basically, won the fake election,
Mm.
and then people started protesting, and then he basically had to call for Putin's help, and Putin basically, crushed the protest for him. So Lukashenko needs the troops at home, so he's not going to get troops there. Then there was for a moment at the beginning, if you remember, the Syrian fighters, right, where Putin went to Syria and said, "Hey, we need 16,000 Syrian fighters." Um, I believe they were able to draft some, maybe like 1,000 or so, but not that many. But of course, those people are used up. Then he was trying to get the North Koreans to send soldiers, And then like it was a couple of weeks ago, it's like, yeah, look at this. North Koreans are gonna send soldiers. And I don't. I mean, I haven't seen any news reports of like North Korean soldiers being killed on the battlefield. I mean, I think it would probably be in the news, right? I mean, like for instance, I mean, you have like the Foreign Legion, where like U.S. citizens and British and Dutch citizens and Polish, they're getting killed, and usually it gets reported here, like if that happens. So we know for sure that there's Western citizens that are fighting in Ukraine, right? But yeah, I haven't heard of the North Koreans, so it's probably a bluff. But and the Iranians were sending the weapon system, so they were sending a drone that the Iranian army developed, and like reconnaissance, and I think also attack drones. And those were shot down by the Ukrainian army, so which means that the Iranians have sent weapons. But that's about it, right? I mean, I recently saw that there was some like Chinese mortars that were intercepted by the Ukrainians. So, but it seems to me that like that the Chinese might be covertly supplying both sides. Maybe I'm not sure about that. Yeah. So, but there's no decisive, partner that Russia has externally. I mean, they have like these vassal states, right? I mean, like Cuba. I mean, they were a Russian vassal since the Cuban Revolution, right? Where basically, I mean, you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and yeah, I mean, Castro believed that his regime could exist because of the Soviet support, right? And I think even today's Cuban government, they're like, yeah, I mean, they sort of accept American tourists now, I think, right? There was some opening, but it's okay. We're gonna take the U.S. dollar, but we're still grateful to the Russians. I think that's the mindset. But yeah, I don't think that Russia has a lot of external support. And but I don't know. They probably have enough weapons to continue fighting it for a while. They're going to run out of the high precision ammunition that the Ukrainians have a lot of now because of the basically Western countries, the NATO supply. So structurally, I think in terms of materiel, I think that the balance over time is going to shift to the Ukrainian side. In terms of the personnel side, I think that it's going to even out maybe, and then the Russians might have an advantage. But yeah, in terms of the morale, I think the morale cannot be underestimated, right? Because in the first couple of days of the invasion, when the NATO weapons hadn't trickled in yet, or not in enough numbers, basically the entire difference in the war was made by the morale. Because I mean, at that point, I mean, the Russian advantage, was probably like 6-1, 7-1. But the morale was just the morale, and also the military tactics. I think that the Ukrainians were more flexible because they adopted NATO-style military strategy, which is more flexible at the tactical level. So like in the military, there's like a strategic and a tactical level. So the tactical is basically like, like on the field, like the smallest units, right? Deciding, whether to, go to the left or go to the right, and how you attack. And then the strategic is sort of at like if you zoom out in the map, right? It's sort of like taking like important areas. Like for instance, I don't know, like taking a mountain, for instance, because because then you can control the surrounding regions, right? Easier. So yeah, the Ukrainians operate certainly much better there. Um, and yeah, they seem to be fighting the righteous battle. And so I think the end story for them is going to be good, but that's over the long term, right? I mean, and the long term is like, how long is that going to be? I mean, the most ideal case scenario is, within 1 month, there's going to be so much revolt in Russia that it's like the whole regime is going to come down in Russia. Um, the next best scenario is to wait until next year for it to happen, right? Basically. And the Western position, I mean, the German position is going to get better and better also over the years. Because, the LNG ports are going to be ready. Because of the green energy minister, I mean, they're building more solar panels and windmills than they have ever done before. I mean, your family's from Bavaria, so you know about the opposition to windmills in Bavaria, right? And now the latest thing I've heard is that even the Bavarian government is approving a lot of windmill projects now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the unintended consequences of war is accelerated a green alternative. Uh, it's made people realize the seriousness of being dependent on oil and gas from a country like Russia. Now it's sort of flipped. Yeah, it's created more environmental consciousness. Now again, I have to look at public opinion data if I can look at it in Germany. If we can say that's true. I think there's enough evidence that probably it is true. But there's still people, that differ from left to right. So you're going to have differences of opinion on if you're, left to right. There's, as I mean, like in Germany, there are people that are more conservative that think it's really needs to be a return to nuclear power immediately, and coal, right, to use it in the mix. But I think more on the green, I would say the green left wants to maintain the course of just, we said no more nuclear power plants. Now I can't remember his name, Robert, the environmental minister.
Robert Habeck.
He's trying to make some kind of a deal where it's only in like emergency situations where they don't think they can maintain the power for the winter. They may allow 2 nuclear power plants to temporarily
operate for 4 more months or something, right?
Yeah, it was like a temporary thing. It wasn't like a permanent thing.
Right. The key is the heating season, right? So the heating season starts in November and it goes until April. So this is really the crunch period. So we have to really see whether the Europeans are going to survive this with the high electric energy prices. The Germans, they have a full gas storage facility, but then I looked at the estimates. I mean, with the demand for households and industry over the winter, I mean, even a full gas tank is like 2.5 to 3 months, and so I mean, so you're probably going to be empty by end of December, end of December, right? And but then the coldest month is still going to be in January, so it's like, okay, when I guess is the expectation perhaps that the LNG ports are going to open up, and then they can start, shipping in a little bit more gas. And the numbers that the gas export from Norway has increased a little bit. The European Union also signed new gas contracts with Azerbaijan. which is very interesting because Azerbaijan has been attacking Armenia, right? Which is another violation of international law. And the pipelines are not going through Armenia; they're going through Azerbaijan, Georgia, the Black Sea, and then down Turkey, and then I think to Greece, and then to the rest of Europe. So yeah, but the Europeans have been very quiet about Armenia, because you would think, hey, Armenia is a Christian country, and then maybe the Europeans, and then the Azerbaijan is like Muslim country, so maybe there's going to be some cultural alignment there. But I mean, ultimately, I think I think the European way of thinking is that you cannot fight a two-front war. I mean, I'm sure that if they didn't have the Ukraine war right now, I think they would speak out more about the Armenia issue. But now they're like, okay, we're gonna hang back because we cannot fight a two-front war.
Yeah, it's too much.
Yeah. I mean, and also like if you look at like the entire post-Soviet space, I mean, if you look Tajikistan and
Uzbekistan,
no, Kyrgyzstan.
Okay.
Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and they in the border region, they have an armed conflict right now. And yeah, I mean, these are sort of like dormant conflicts. I mean, they've not been awoken while they were part of the joint military alliance with Russia. But now, because the Russians are so busy in Ukraine, they're like, okay, well, now we can start to fight, and the Russians are not going to hold us back. And so, well, who's going to benefit? I mean, so with the Armenia situation, we know the Americans are benefiting because, as I said, Pelosi just went to Armenia. The Central Asian countries are a little bit too far away for America, and because for the Americans, I mean, because the Americans already say, okay, Russia is our enemy, China's our enemy, Iran is our enemy, and then we abandoned Afghanistan last year. So basically, there's no access to Central Asia geographically, so the Americans don't have anything to say there. So I think the Central Asia region, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, I think over time, maybe not this year, but over time, like next couple of years, they're going to shift to the Chinese sphere of influence. Because for the Chinese, they're like, okay, well, they're direct geographic neighbors, and then also, they're most easiest to control. Therefore, it's a way to prevent, cross-border, flows to support the Uyghur populations, which the Chinese say, oh well, we want to hold down their aspirations, right? And also it's part of the Silk Road initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That you need these Central Asian states, and also they have a lot of gas and oil and resources that China needs. So over the long term, what I see, okay, so Russia is losing out because of the technology sanctions. I mean, right now, I mean, you see technology sanctions, I mean, it sounds very fancy, and then people are like, oh my God, it doesn't do anything. And actually it does, but it takes time. Like it's really phased in, because usually, so what is technology sanction? Semiconductors, chips, basically like small components that go into electronics, right? And those are in most of the electronic things that are being used. And those things, they work for a certain time, and then you need the replacement parts, like within these chips, these electronic devices. So from time to time, you replace them, right? So that they can continue to function. And it's only now that, over many months and years, that the Russians notice, holy shit, we cannot use these electronics anymore. We can't build any more cars. We cannot maintain our airplanes, so they're grounded effectively. So those things, they take time to kick in, but they will eventually kick in. The Russians stockpiled some of the electronic components, so that's why it was going to take longer to have a negative impact visible. But if that continues, I mean, they're going to be a third world country. I mean, so because without electronics, you're not part of modern civilization. So eventually what's going to happen is that, I mean, their only hope basically is China, because China is the only other country that does not participate in the Western sanctions directly, and would be capable of supplying the Russians with the things they need. Now, so far, the Chinese are a little bit hesitant to go with full backing of Russia because of the secondary sanctions that the Americans are threatening on the Chinese companies. And even though there's some decoupling between China and America now with technology sanctions and so forth that the Americans are applying, I think that there's still some technology dependence on the Chinese side towards America, where they're like, okay, we're going to go along with the Russia sanctions, at least on the electronics part, because the Chinese are still buying the raw material, like the oil and the gas from Russia. So yeah, but okay, but it's okay. These are short-term things. I mean, the long-term thing is that. So in my view, this is inevitable. The inevitable outcome is that Russia is going to be a vassal state to China.
Oh wow, that's a good big hypothesis. I never looked at it that way. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what are they going to do? I mean, so the only way to the West. I mean, if the Western line holds on sustaining the sanctions through the winter and through the next years, the only way for the Russians to be part of civilization. I mean, they could go down the pariah state, like Venezuela, North Korea, Iran.
Yeah. But they will no longer be a superpower. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, but they'll have the nuclear weapons. I guess.
Are they even a super? Yeah, they are a superpower now again, right? Which is, I always thought that Russia, after the fall of the cold, during the fall, the Iron Curtain, people started to say that it was disintegrated, it lost its superpower status, and now there's an attempt by Russia to again reacquire its superpower status. And now you're saying it may disintegrate to where it loses its superpower status and it's just internal or something in the military, or they're going to run out of troops and they can keep burning troops, but that the reality is that Russia will no longer be a superpower and it will just disintegrate. So we're kind of getting at.
Yeah. So if you go back to historical sociology, Michael Mann from UCLA, I mean, he developed this theorem of power and four sources of social powers. He talks about the political sphere, the culture, ideological sphere, the military sphere, and the economic sphere. So it's very useful to have these four dimensions in mind, because among all these spheres, I mean, I only see the Russians doing well on the military side, right? I mean, and on all of the other indicators, I mean, it's kind of going sideways. I mean, the economy has been stagnating, sanctions for 8 years now. The political power, yeah, I mean, I guess it's an authoritarian state, but and so I guess there's some domestic stability, but yeah, but it's only strong in terms of that military projection abroad and winning military confrontations. And then the other spheres, it's sort of not doing so well. On the demographic side, it is doing terribly because you have people that are leaving the country now. You have very low rates of fertility. There's some immigration, interestingly, because of the former Soviet countries, like the Central Asian countries, are sending a lot of migrant workers to Russia. But the overall demographic development is quite negative in Russia. So they were only doing well in the military side of things. And then now because they're kind of being pushed back in Ukraine and they're potentially losing that war. Not even that is going to be, not even the military side is going to be there for them. I mean, Russia is going to be safe from an invasion externally, I think, because of the nuclear weapons again, right? It's a major deterrent potential. So the destabilization that could be happening in Russia, where there's a small potential that the republics within Russia, right, that's why it's called Russian Federation, right? It's a federation of.
Oh, a break off or something?
Yeah, there could be a break off. Well, I mean, right now that's only speculation that I've read about, because right now it's Putin is still strong, whatever. But that's the thing. I mean, if the republics within Russia have distrust of the center,
yeah,
because they think, well, the center is not taking care of us anymore, they basically throw and waste their resources into fighting an unwinnable war. There could come a point where sort of like the local republics are going to take the matters into their own hand, and then there could be a breakup. Now, I mean, if that were to happen, I think that would be scary, to be honest with you, because it is a nuclear power. I mean, remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was one of the largest nuclear power states in the world until the Budapest Agreement in '94, when the Ukrainians surrendered their nukes to Russia. And that was a very fateful and a wrong decision in retrospect. And in the Budapest Agreement, the Russians promised to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And when Putin was asked about it, he said, this was Boris Yeltsin's promise, not my promise. I mean, that's how sneaky and sleazy he is. But I mean, like, but the Americans, I mean, they break the treaties too, right? I mean, the Paris Climate Accord, which negotiated by Obama, and then Trump said, yeah, this is Obama's treaty. I don't give a shit about that. And then the Iran nuclear deal, which is also Obama era, right?
Yeah.
Trump said, I don't give a shit about that, So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, the countries are run by people, and then if the countries are powerful, they kind of do whatever they want. So
strong man, like a strong man, autocratic kind of forms of rule. They're making a comeback, right? So refeudalization, at least in Russia.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would fit. I don't know if that would fit with Russia, but
yeah, but certainly, I mean, there will have to be a new model that they would have to come up with, how they can go forward. I mean, the most important thing, I think, politically, ideologically, that has to happen is that this Ruski Mir, right, the Russian world ideology, where basically the idea is that Russia is a superpower and we can do whatever we want. I think that idea has to be completely destroyed, right? Like, because if you don't destroy that, then I think then you're gonna have the menace hanging over Europe. I mean, Europe is going to be a hotbed of violence and conflict. And I don't have any interest in that outcome. I mean, because I debate. I mean, I have friends in Canada, North America here, and they're like North American isolationists. You can call them that, right?
Yeah.
Because these are people who are saying, "Yeah, fuck NATO," and why do I care about Ukraine? Ukraine is far away. It's kind of what Trump used to argue, if you remember, right?
Like very nativists, right? Or what do you call them? Isolationists.
Isolationist, right? It's not completely wrong. I think that if Europe was part of the Russian sphere of influence, I think America is still going to be safe. I mean, because American military spending is just so much. It's a lot of money, and then we have the second largest nuclear arsenal behind Russia. So, I mean, the U.S. itself is going to be safe, right? Physically. It's just the American influence would obviously decrease, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because then, because in America would basically be, well, you have Canada and Mexico basically, but nothing else. So probably from a world status perspective, it's probably nativism is kind of a stupid idea, but also my counter argument is more selfish. I mean, because I grew up in Europe, so I have a direct stake in the peace in Europe. I mean, I think if I was born and raised in America, I mean, I'm sure like if you were like a native born American, right? I mean, I think you would take much less interest in Eastern Europe, right? But you might have some family ties there, so you might say, okay, well, yeah, I can see that's important. And if you watch like Annaville and Markus Lanz and these German talk shows, and like last year it was all COVID, and now it's like now it's only about Ukraine. It's like everything's about that. I haven't watched a lot of the American shows. I'm not sure what they're talking about. I mean, it's might be a little bit isolated from the American discourse.
It's very regional character. I think there's a regionalism as far as what focus of at least local news. So yeah, it's very limited as far as international coverage.
So you mean there's going to be a shooting in this neighborhood or whatever?
Yeah, I actually think you're right. I think that's actually happened now more in Texas. What I observe is the news coverage is a very localized. So we had shootings, things like that. But it's just more from the regional perspective, So maybe it will play a role as far as media and how it dumps this issue, or focuses more on Elizabeth II. And so you see how quickly that goes with agenda setting in the media. And that can have influence on public opinion and public consciousness of how they think about international politics or become immune to it or ignorant about it.
Yeah, I mean, also with the Ukraine thing is not that controversial. I mean, because the only people who are against it are sort of like the Trumpist nativists, So there's like maybe 10% of the members of Congress voted against Ukraine funding bill. But overall, I think it's not that controversial because number one, because most Americans think it's a faraway conflict, like it doesn't affect me directly. And then the other thing is also that when it comes to military industrial complex, I think like people usually shut their eyes about it, because we support the troops, we support the army, we support the defense contractors. It's sort of like, I mean, the military-industrial complex is like a big elephant that stands in the room, right? But you're not supposed to point towards it. Like. Yeah, that's why it's probably like that's why the Ukraine funding is very uncontroversial in my view. I mean, it's sort of like that's what we do. That's what we do naturally, right? Of course,
one more thing I wanted to add. I know we're running late, but maybe another component is the public's reaction and sympathy, what I'm going to call as kind of emotional capital. So, maybe that's and it has an effect that we're showing sympathy that the American public sees Ukrainians as victims. And then if you see, the graves or hidden graves that they find, and the stories of children and again, Ukrainian refugees, that creates emotional capital, that there's people that have a stake in it, and then they're supportive of, helping Ukraine militarily, like if they see that. And so I think that's like emotional capital. I don't know if there's a word for it. Randall Collins always had words like that.
It's about emotional energy, right? I mean,
yeah, like it's kind of a, yeah, I'm trying to remember. And again, he had this coin interaction ritual chains.
Yeah, he also had this one paper about 9/11, 9/11 flag waving.
Okay. Oh yeah.
And he made a very simple argument. He's basically like, okay, observe the amount of flag waving before, during, and then this is the period after 9/11, and then 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And I mean, you could think it's almost like, yeah, like it's curved. It goes up very quick, but then it goes down too, right? Where I mean, with anything, I mean, it's like, because it's also the way how the human mind works, right? So if you have a threat, right? If you have, I don't know, a tiger that's jumping at you, the adrenaline shoots up, you try to run away, you try to fight it, whatever, and then the threat recedes, or the threat is still kind of there, but, sort of lurking, not direct.
Yeah.
Then you start to get numb to it. And then you think it's mundane, and then it's kind of, you think, oh, it's going to go away, or maybe it's still going to stick around, but it's going to stay in the background. I mean, you're not going to notice it. That's effectively what happened with COVID. I mean, like the only people that I see still writing a lot about the pandemic is probably people who are like immunocompromised, people who have long COVID, or people who are still suffering from that virus, which, I mean, can be quite a significant minority, I would say. But I would say for the general public, I think this thing's basically over. I mean, sure. I mean, like, there's a reinfection. I mean, you can get it again. I had it twice already. I mean, some people maybe have had it 3 times already. So I mean, it's definitely not gone, but I was making a sociological case now. So in terms of the perception, I think it has receded, right?
Yeah.
The general perception. So, and yeah, and so with a lot of topics they coming in and out, I mean, yeah, I mean, the Ukraine issue, I think it's a little bit further away, and I don't think it's gonna. I don't think it's going to be controversial. I mean, even whatever the outcome of the Congress elections are, I mean, the midterm elections, there's probably going to be more funding for Ukraine. I mean, even into next year, I mean, for sure. The thing that this is going to be the last topic, and then I'll let you.
No, we're good. Yeah, go ahead.
So the abortion topic, we'll have to get back to that, because so I saw in The Economist, there was this interesting article. It was about female voter registration over time, and it shows that there was a spike immediately after the
Dobson.
Dobbs-Jackson ruling. I must strongly assume, so I'm not a political scientist at all, so I don't study this thing, but it seems to me that a majority of the new registrants were, pro-choice, right? So they wanted to, make their voices heard in the election, in order to basically bring Roe v. Wade back, but not as a Supreme Court case, but as legislation in Congress. And then if you remember a few weeks back, the Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, he said, no, what we should be doing is we should be, doing pro-life legislation at the federal level. Which you think about it, I mean, it's a much more drastic than the Dobbs v. Jackson, right? Because all the Supreme Court said was that it's not for the federal government to decide on abortion, but it's the states make the decision. But now the Lindsey Graham, and then there's probably like the moral majority, whatever they call themselves, like the Christian activists, they're like, well, no, we want to have federal pro-life legislation, right? And I don't know. I mean, so it's one thing that struck me. I mean, because I grew up in Europe. I mean, where those abortion debates are sort of pushed to the background, unless you live in Poland or it's probably the only place now. But
Ireland too, I think, right?
Well, in Ireland they liberalized, right?
Yeah.
I think they
Wasn't there a big topic about it in Spain for? I know they're liberalized now too, right? What about like Italy? No.
In Italy, they no, I think it's allowed. I think in every European country except Poland.
Yeah.
And it's an issue because you have like Polish women, who they have to get the bus ticket and then they go to Germany or they go to Czech Republic. Because it's very interesting because if you look at the Central East European countries, Czech Republic, they're extremely secular society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like they have churches and everything, but they're not very religious. But the Poles, they're very religious, or relatively more religious.
Very religious.
Yeah, that's right. And so they the governing party takes abortion is the major wedge issue, and
well, even Austria isn't it still predominantly Roman Catholic? No, or is it gone decline? Is it?
Yeah, it's in a decline now. I think it's very clearly that's what's happening. There was this very good report that I read while I was there in Vienna. It was they interviewed, I think in Vorarlberg, which is the southwestern province, and there was an abortion doctor, and he was the only abortion doctor in the province, in the entire province, which probably several 100,000 population. And you can already, and he's already an older guy. He's in his late 60s, early 70s. He thinks about retiring, but he doesn't know because there's no successor that he has found yet. So the women there might have to travel further out, or they try to Germany or whatever to do abortion. So because it's a conservative in the rural area, right? So and in Germany it's the same thing, right? If you live in like in Hamburg or in Berlin, I think it's probably not an issue to find an abortion doctor.
Mm-hmm. Rural areas,
yeah. If you live in like rural Bavaria, it's probably going to be an issue, right? Or in Baden-Württemberg. Those are two Catholic provinces, right?
Yeah.
States. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, so I think in the U.S. So I think. So okay, so I'm raising this issue of abortion not to debate this issue of abortion, right? I think about the political salience of it, which is if the voter registration trend holds and it's serious. I mean, my projection before Dobbs v. Jackson was that the Republicans are going to win the midterms because of the bad economy, because of the inflation. Now I don't. Now I think it's a toss up, right? I mean, now it's not clear.
Yeah, it may backfire. Yeah, you know, the it may backfire on Republicans regarding the direction even the Supreme Court has gone. So I think the religious right may have overplayed its cards, and it may, yeah, like you say, it may result in more women voters voting, based on their values. Yeah. So the culture wars are alive, but the consequences is when it shifts too far to the right, then there's going to be reaction more from the secular left, and yeah, so that would make sense. But how much are they able to mobilize? That depends also on recruitment, or how do they get out the vote. So I mean, there's a problem in Texas, like with Beto, that he's running against the conservative governor Abbott, and it's just a matter of demographics, and it's difficult sometimes to get many people to vote. And so if everybody were to vote, then Beto might have a chance. But the problem is people often don't vote, and then there's this, it can advantage rural counties over urban counties. And even if you were to take Houston, Dallas, and El Paso, which historically has been more democratic, it cannot outnumber all the rural areas, and definitely not all the suburbs, which are sometimes, not blue,
Beto ran for
not
Senate,
blue.
right? So he knows about state level trends, and he lost against I think Ted Cruz, right?
Yeah, one of the techniques I think which may have helped Abbott is he focuses on different topics. So then he went to when there was this flooding. He was right here, like I think within the first few days, and so he shifts topics. He knows how to do agenda setting, right? So it kind of puts attention away as far as possible backlash. He focuses on topics then that he thinks he can get more moderates, and so
because people want to have a secure border, right? They don't want.
Yeah, that's a second. That's a favorite topic, but yeah, I think he has a good chance Abbott will get reelected. There's a 5-point margin difference as far as the latest polls, but it's hard for a Democrat to win. Texas, it's just been challenging because of the rural areas and the lack, voting differences between rural voters and urban people in urban spaces, urban areas, cities, basically. Right. So I sound like a political scientist now, but like it's demographics and also the voter participation.
And I was also reading about the Latino shift to the Republican side, because I mean it used to be that they were like very solid Democratic voters, and now I think it's much more competitive. Presumably, yeah. I mean the fact that as long as they don't, as long as the Republicans don't give off like this kind of like a white supremacist kind of riff to it, right? I mean, if they're saying, yeah, okay, but we believe in, like, if they make it about like sort of like cultural values, right? So, abortion, Catholicism, which of course a lot of Latino voters are. I mean, or it's about hard work and patriotism, and so those are things that or gun, even gun ownership. Why not? So it's, you make it about these broader cultural issues rather than like making it racially exclusive. Then I think then I think that the Latino electorate soon is going to turn more on the Republican side. And also, interestingly, on immigration, I mean, this is also one fascinating thing where, like first generation, but even second generation migrants, they want to have a strong border because their idea is, well, because we came the regular way, right? So we're not the illegals. So other people have to do the same, and so then they might actually be more nativist than a native-born population to some extent, right? So that's also like one political dynamic, which again is going to play for the Republicans positively. You see, I think the Democratic winning coalition. I mean, I'll go back to Bernie Sanders again. I think that, I mean, his idea is like, okay, we're not going to agree on abortion. We're not going to agree on gun rights. We're not going to agree on immigration. But we're going to agree on healthcare, education, social spending, public sector, public investment, jobs, green energy transition. We're going to agree on those things. And if you vote for me, then I'll give you that. And so there were a lot of voters. I mean, you remember 2016, and even 2020, right? I mean, it's like it's going to be Trump or it's going to be Bernie. And if you put anybody else like Clinton or Biden, it's like, no, forget about it. Right? So that populistic turn where you sort of, I mean, eventually you have to address the social cultural issues too, but I mean, at least in the electoral process, I think you should bypass it. That would probably be the winning coalition in my view. I mean, I don't know. But then some people say, no, most people are moderate. You're gonna scare off the moderates. With Bernie's agenda. So I don't know.
Oh, you mean that the left should focus on traditional left issues, and the center is a trap? No, you know what I mean. I mean, the center is
no, right. So it depends who you ask, right? So if you're a progressive, then you're like, yes, we should take the progressive agenda.
Yeah.
But then there's some of these centrists actually. I mean, like so the DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, the sort of Bill Clinton type, Hillary Clinton type, and they're like, no, we have to cover the center, because the center it's gonna cover the moderates and the Republican, and then the moderates and the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And that's how, I mean, Biden had this very comfortable position actually in 2020, right? Because you could say, well, look at the bad pandemic handling of Trump. So if you're sort of like an unpolitical kind of centrist who just wants to have somebody who manages the economy and the pandemic well, okay, so I have those voters at the center, right? Then I have the moderate Republicans, the ones who hate Trump because he was dragging the party down, whatever, with his nativism and racism, etc. So you got those votes. Then you have the the centrist Democrats, because they, because Biden comes from there, right? But even the progressive Democrats, like the Bernie Democrats, they're like, okay, we got those people too, because because they're like, they're also in this like everybody but Trump camp, like they don't like Biden, but they hate Trump, that's sort of thing, right? And that was a comfortable position for Biden, where he didn't really have to say or do too much.
He just was the opposition.
Yeah, and then that's enough. That the coalition is big enough. Now that's 2020. It's a unique situation. I mean, if you're trying to do that 2024, I think it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough.
Agree,
So Trump says he's going to run again, but I think it will come down to Ron DeSantis probably, and
yeah.
And I don't know. Does Greg Abbott, this the Texas governor?
Who knows? I mean, he might run as a vice president. It could be. It's difficult to know. Yeah, I don't have enough information yet. I don't know where it's going to go. DeSantis is probably a good Republican choice.
Yeah,
but I don't know if there are other candidates that might, also play a role. There's some talk maybe Ted Cruz might enter presidential, run, but it's really unknown. I mean,
I mean, Ted Cruz. I mean, he plays a certain, like, I mean, it's really the moral majority, the Christian right. I mean, I think he plays up that wing quite well. And to be quite frank, I mean, so he was number 2. It's in 2016. He was number 2 behind Trump, if you remember. But so towards the end, you had Trump, you had Ted Cruz, and then there was John Kasich. I think those are the 3 that were towards the end. And then Kasich eventually dropped out too, and then Cruz eventually dropped out. So I think Cruz sort of. I mean, so if it wasn't for Trump, I think maybe Cruz would have been the candidate. And but I don't know. I mean, it's going to be 8 years on, right? I mean, is he going to be as popular? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I don't know.
I mean, he kind of sounds like one of these politicians, sleazeballs. I mean, but I don't know. So might be Biden. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out.
Yeah. Well, also Biden. I mean, he's 80 years old now. He's going to be 82 when he wants to run again.
Yeah.
He's not doing too well. Okay, so
right.
so we'll call it.
We're ended.
Hey,
Larry, awesome.
But thank you very much, Mike, for joining me here.
All right, awesome.